Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm wearing a mic here so everybody can hear me. How about in the back? Al, can you hear me fine? Okay. All right, I don't know what's up with the lights, but we'll have to live with that. All right. Welcome to Rhode Island. Hopefully everybody had safe and simple travels here and not too much traffic. Connecticut can be pretty difficult, but if you flew into TFC there, you probably didn't have any problem at all. So again, welcome to Rhode Island. I got a little bit of notes here, so Jim wanted to know where my PowerPoint was this morning. So anyway, this is it right here. So take the simple route. First, I wanted to sort of introduce the team that have helped basically put this conference together. We've been working on it for over a year. And everything is like always comes down to the last minute, so that's how these things are. But anyway, Debbie Sarabian right here. A big field person, Donald Perzak right here. Jim, could you stand up? All right. Christy's been a huge help right there taking pictures, so make sure she gets a big welcome. I've had many other folks that have helped, and you'll see them throughout the week. So if you do have questions, just make sure that they get answered. Donald, if he doesn't know the answer, or Debbie, or I don't know the answer, Jim knows the answers to everything. So go to Jim, and he will be able to figure that out for you. Okay? Let's see. So the next thing is that basically there are the bathrooms. Okay? And so the women's bathroom is on this floor. The men's are one floor up and one floor down. Okay? So we're in a pretty small area, so there might be a line or something like that. So sort of put that into consideration. All right? So that's about the bathrooms. We're in the actually we're at the Graduate School of Oceanography. Across the street where you registered, that's the Coastal Institute. The Coastal Institute is actually its own entity within the University of Rhode Island. It was set up essentially to be a place where folks could come together and work on knowledge and work on communications for science. And so it's a great place for us to have this meeting of the National Cooperative Soil Survey. Okay? So, but make sure that you recognize that we're a guest being here as well. Okay? And so sort of keep that in mind. Other folks are still working here and things like that. So it's not like we have all this time. Keep that in mind. Let's see. We also have a special guest this morning that Apu will introduce in a few minutes, and he'll have a chance to address us. And so we're very pleased that's been able to come about. Let's see. And then, Debbie, I think you are going to be the moderator for the morning session here and introduce Pooh. And I guess before I get started, are there any questions that folks have? Okay. Give me one more minute here. And then Jim wants me to remind everyone that there is some volleyball that's going to be set up this afternoon after the meeting down by the beach. It is a public beach, so sort of keep that in mind. But we want you to have a good time while you're here. It's a beautiful spot. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay? Anything else? Hold on.
All right, good morning and welcome. They're in your packet. There is a handout for the bylaws. There's a vote open till 2 p.m. today. And please come to that meeting this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce Pooh. Pooh Von Comedy is celebrating his 10th anniversary as the NRCS State Conservationist for Rhode Island. Congratulations. Before coming to the Ocean State, he held numerous positions within the agency. He began his federal career as a student trainee in Minnesota. There he worked in 8 different field offices, beginning as a soil conservationist, then a district conservationist, followed by an outreach coordinator. From there, he moved on to Oklahoma, where he served as assistant state conservationist for field operations. After serving as acting state conservationist in Iowa, he was selected for the position he holds now. Prue was born in a small village in Laos and emigrated to the United States in 1981. Woo! You look pretty good there, Prue. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in soil science from the University of Wisconsin and has received the Secretary of Agriculture's Honor Award for supporting the President's management agenda and civil rights. Prue and his wife have 2 children. Welcome, Prue, please. You need this because it's being taped.
Oh, okay. All right.
Pocket or here if you're.
All right, I'll be right here. Good morning. Welcome to Rhode Island. Wow. We didn't expect this big crowd, but that's what Jim said. So, you can, I take Jim's word for that. One thing I like to say is that I want to welcome you to the smallest state in the nations. But I also want to remind you that we're not that small because we do have 2 senators, just like Texas and Alaska, okay? So, we're as big as you all. Again, I want to congratulate to all involved in the national conference here, and I believe this is 120 years of the celebration or your work, I believe. A little about me when I started with NRCS is that I did apply for soil scientist positions. Graduate from, before I was graduate from Stephen Point. Is any pointer out there? Oh, yes, okay. So when I applied for soil scientist and they take a look at me and they're like, oh, I don't think soil scientists are going to work for you. They show me the orca who's taller than me. So they don't think that I can be a soil scientist. But they say, well, soil conservationist will work. I say, all right, I want a job, so I take the job. And been with NRCS or SCS ever since. I came here in 1981, not 1881. It's like, 100 years later, but. Oh, I know. I feel like I'm probably a vampire, So anyway, one thing about Rhode Island, we have a total land of 1,212 square miles. Total water area is about 511 square miles. That's 33% of water area and the 3rd highest of the U.S. after Michigan's and Hawaii. So we have 400 miles of shoreline. We might not have a lot of land, but we do have a lot of water as well. Okay? So, there are about 1,043 farms and almost 57,000 acres of farmland in Rhode Island. So pretty small, like it's one big county in Iowa or Minnesota, right? But the agriculture range from traditional vegetable and food operation to livestock and shellfish. That's a big thing in Rhode Island, shellfish. After all, we are ocean state. So, 95% of our farm, our family farm. Okay, we have about 363,000 acres of forest land in Rhode Island. So, look like the forest land is a little bit more than croplands. Rhode Island official state soil is Narragansett. This is Narragansett town, by the way, where you have a conference. It's a nice town, guys. Enjoy it when you're here. Really, a lot of nice thing to see in Narragansett. Rhode Island became the lead state to venture into the coastal soil and soil survey directly because my former state conservationists have a vision of Rhode Island to become center of excellence of coastal soil survey. So I am really proud to inherit that visions. In 2002, Rhode Island had adopted working waters strategic plan and put Farm Bill money into coastal restorations. We received $1 million for eelgrass work and planting, and the site was selected and the soil data were identified, but there was no sub-acres soil data, so that's the beginning of the sub-acres soil mapping, I believe. Okay. Rhode Island is the first state to complete the statewide soil survey, which is in 1981. But the year I got here to the United States, a long time ago. The first to have a statewide digital soil, which was done in 1996. The first coastal soil and soil survey in 2010, and the first freshwater sub-acre soil in 2011. So with that, I want to thank you for the planning committee, Debbie Servo, Jacob Isler, Christina Willie, Mark Stoll, and Jim Terrain for organizing the conference. Thank you. I appreciate it. Please give me my hand. With that, I also like to thank the Soil Survey Divisions and the National Soil Survey Center, Kellogg Soil Survey Lab, URI, College of the Environment and Life Science, Society of Soil Scientists of Southern New England, and all of the state and federal partners for your partnership and the support. Thank you. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest of honor, Undersecretary Mr. Murphy. A little bit about him. I think he's going to go a little bit about him, but I know a little bit that he just got appointed about a year ago, farmer from Iowa, and he's really interested, have a high interest about the soil survey. So after all, we can grow without soil. He's a farmer himself, he knows it. So welcome, Mr. Murphy.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for the chance to be able to be here. Very glad to be able to be here. And certainly, one of my most important roles is to say thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. As Pooh said, agriculture in this country is built on our soils. And what we don't know can hurt us. It's very important for us to be able to know what's out there. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, driving out in the fields, and certainly a very much of a layman's kind of understanding. I just knew where not to go when it was wet, not to get stuck, and where we needed to spread manure from our cattle and other kinds of things. And that you could start to see, that was well before yield monitors, you could start to see some yield and productivity differences and fertility differences, and understand that there was differences underneath that soil as well, that topsoil that was there. But that was our life. That was our livelihood. And I just knew my little piece of the world, because that's the world that I spend every day in. And as I got a little bit of a chance to see some other places, you start to realize how every place is unique. And certainly you all know that from wherever you're at now, and if you've spent time at other places as well, you start to realize how big this is and how much of an understanding. We were talking at breakfast this morning about soils, not only on the ground, but under the water. And to be able to understand the soils that are needed and best for oyster production. And those are things I think that you'll have conversations about as well, and something that an Iowa farm boy doesn't think about, but how important all those pieces are. And so thank you for the work that you do. It's hugely important that this happened. And I got a chance as I got off the farm, went to Iowa State University, and I was an ag business major, so I was on the econ side, and yet we had some chances to get to agronomy classes and animal science classes and other kinds of things. I remember a great kind of professor with a personality, Dr. Wayne Schultes. And I don't know, anybody have any reason to know Dr. Schultes? A few folks. That tells you how old we all are, because he hasn't taught there for a while. But he would put on a pair of plaid pants to class and sometimes stand up on the desk in the front of the room and get your attention, and it probably took that for econ students to be able to get their attention around soils and some of the other science pieces. But certainly one of those things that stuck was it's not dirt, it's soil. And that understanding and appreciation for the productivity and the difference and the understanding. And I never got deep enough to be able to understand all the pieces and the terminology that you all know. And the descriptions that you're able to apply and be able to share the kinds of things that are so important in those descriptions. But then I got a chance as well to be Secretary of Agriculture in Iowa, and to be able to understand. We worked very closely with our conservation. We had a division of conservation and water quality at the department that housed with NRCS and our soil and water conservation districts as well. And then starting to understand, although I would have been slightly aware, but the engineering aspects of soil and structure and construction as well. And one of those great places that as again, much too narrow a point of view, but we had a water quality practice that we were interested in. We did saturated buffers. Saturated buffers, or you take a tile line, you come up just a little short of your drainage ditch or your stream. You put that water into a tile that's parallel to that stream and let that water seep out through the soil and take the nutrients out of that water before it gets into that body that you're draining the soil out, or draining the water out of. And so the benefits of that were some significant benefits, and you've got to obviously have a bypass to make sure that you don't lose the drainage capacity. But for our soils, that was a very constructive practice. And of course, we were wondering why it was taking so long for us to get a national standard around what a bioreactor or a saturated buffer should look like. And then we realized, of course, every soil is different. And the structure in Midwestern soils of having high organic matter, soils that can hold that you can understand what that distance is from that stream, and whether that water is going to wash that soil away, or whether you're going to have enough organic matter to be able to get through it, and the stability of the walls of either that stream or that drainage ditch was different everywhere. And again, it depends. One of our challenges that we have is we have Congress passes a farm bill, passes legislation where we're able to put practices on the ground. We have an EQIP program, or we have a conservation innovation grant, or other programs, and they've got to work in Rhode Island and Iowa and Alaska and New Mexico, across all different kinds of farms and soil conditions, and we have to find practices that have their applicability. Actually, even Northwest Iowa and Southeast Iowa, they can be different, let alone across the country. And that ability to understand is so important about what we're working with, and then to be able to have the flexibility to be able to make these programs and processes and engineering steps change as we get to different locations so that they're practical and they work in other places. The Farm Bill just passed last November. Why don't we have it all in place? Well, we're working on it. We're getting pieces in place. You'll see more parts of that Farm Bill come out this next year. We just announced some conservation innovation grants, on-farm soil health, SIGs that folks can do as well. And you'll see more of those pieces come out. Really, the bulk of the new provisions with the conservation provisions will come out in October, but those things that we're able to come out with now that are kind of self-enacting, or that we can hang on the old program, we're able to come out with some of those. But you saw this emphasis on soils and soil health and that understanding, not just what we have out there, but how we can impact what we have out there too, at least the top part of it, what we can understand and how we can impact, and I would argue a new appreciation for our impact, not just of the loss of productivity of soils by having it erode or blow away, but the impact that we can have as a living soil and reconstructing in some parts, at least adding to the productivity and certainly capturing some of that carbon that the sun and the plants create. And how can we use that soil as a structure, not only for productivity, but the greater impact that's out there as well. You saw that come out of that Farm Bill. I think you see that all across agriculture right now in an appreciation. And most of us, again, have a hard time describing it. We know there's a difference in tilt. We know there's a difference in soils, but we have a hard time describing it. We're still trying to come up with those measures that are perfect, those models that are predictive, that understanding of how it works when you don't have enough rain and when you have a lot of rain, and those kinds of things that interact with the environment that we have in a way that we can understand the practices that can make some slow improvements in that soil that you all recognize is so different from place to place. How do we attach that? How do we describe that? I would say another interesting piece that came out of that Farm Bill was an emphasis, and you probably saw it as well, and our soils work has always engaged this, and that's the sharing of data. The sharing of the data that we're able to create. Well, I run around farms with a soil survey book from Dickinson County, Iowa, in my pickup, all marked up, tear out pages, try and, almost digitize it before we had digitizing, to be able to figure out how many acres worth of cleared Nicollet Webster soil and how many acres of Okoboji soil I had on a farm. And on a farm I might be able to rent and what it would be worth and all those kinds of things. Data sharing was important from the very beginning. To be able to understand this is not just for us, this is not just on how we construct things, this is on how folks manage, what they need to know about what they're able to use on their farms. And we're trying to figure out how we do that in lots of other places. How do we do that with yield information from crop insurance and interact that with practice information that we may have as well. We know that there's a lot of inadequacies, and in part, I would argue that the vision of bringing NRCS and FSA and RMA together through a farm production and conservation missionary was about making sure that we were one place for farmers to be able to deal with, but we also had processes that allowed that information to be able to move back and forth. We created IT systems separately, so the folks in an NRCS office had to walk across and grab a paper map from FSA and then had to take the information that they created in technical assistance for a CRP project across the hall, and it had to get entered in at FSA, and we're trying to bring those IT systems together so we can electronically handle data in the same format, but be able to move that information around as well. And you will constantly see little pieces, and it's big project to be able to look at farmers.gov and how we're able to provide more accessibility to our farmers out there of this information as well. And so that they can sign up and participate in projects. We all know the heart and soul of our two FSA and NRCS is our county office. And it's where somebody walks in, has a conversation, can ask questions, can understand what that crazy new acronym is, whatever it is. They'll never figure out an FPAC, and they don't need to. They'll know an FSA and an NRCS, and they'll know an EQIP or an ARC PLC, or they'll know some of those other acronyms. They've got to have somebody to talk to, but they also need to now be able to, as much as they can, grab a phone and be able to get online and look at things. So I would argue, like you can, and being able to look at your soils information and soil web and be able to look and see what's online and where you're at and what the differences are. We need to provide that same kind of accessibility for their conservation plan, for them to be able to finish sign a document after they have completed some of that process in the office if they want to. We're always going to need that office. We're always going to need somebody that can talk to folks, because you know how different one side of the farm is from the other side of the farm. But we also need that accessibility through online activities as well, because we have a generation that is much more comfortable doing that. We have technology that's much easier for those of us to be able to do it. We talked this morning about how much has changed in the way that we communicate. Thank goodness for cell phones. Sometimes, right? Sometimes they're a real hassle. We just wish in fact, we were actually over this last weekend, and my wife and I went up to West Virginia to some areas, some farming areas up there, and some parks and other areas, and lost cell phone service completely. And we were trying to do some emails back on some stuff back to the office, and it was actually quite nice to be able to say I was out of cell phone range. But at the same token, it's also nice to be able to have it, and we know how efficient it is. We need to be able to use it, but not let it become such a burden that it distracts us from all the other things that we need to do in real time wherever we're at. But that accessibility needs to happen as well. To be able to think of 120 years worth of discovering and looking at soils. On the way into the office, I walked past a portrait of Tama Jim Wilson, who was Secretary of Agriculture. One of the reasons I even pay attention to him is he's from Iowa. He grew up in the Northeast, but he lived in Iowa, was a professor, and I think Dean of Agriculture at Iowa State University. Then became U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1897 to 1913. 16 years. Longest serving cabinet officer ever. Served 3 actually into the 4th presidency. So McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Taft, and then into Wilson as well. And so those presidencies, and at least the premise that I've heard from proud Iowans is that he really took the agriculture department, USDA, from more of a cultural agency to more of a science-based agency. And I have no idea whether he had any activity around looking at soils and that productivity and providing some resources, both internal to USDA, but to the farmers as well as understanding. But it does happen to be about 120 years ago that many of those things happened. And I think there was a cultural change that was very important. And I would say, I want you to know, certainly from my perspective, from everybody that I work with, that science is still the basis of what we need to do at USDA. It's what farmers expect from us as well. We need to be able to base our decisions on good decisions, and you're a huge part of making that happen. So thank you all. Thank you for the work that you do. that you have done, for those that came before you, for the work that you're establishing, the technology that you're able to employ and think about and create for others as well. We all know, as much as we know, we don't know it all yet. There's so much more to know. I was with somebody, we did some things around water quality in the state of Iowa, putting together a nutrient reduction strategy, other kinds of things. And we kept having folks say, when are you going to be done? When are you going to be done with this? I said, well, when are we going to be done trying to figure out how to grow corn with less inputs and more productivity? We're never going to be done. And that certainly is true around the science of agriculture, certainly the science of soils. There's so much more to learn about what's going on within those soils, about what all the soils are, the ability to be able to understand how they change over time. And we have many folks that need an appreciation for that soil that's out there. We talk about one of those additional challenges we had in Iowa when folks would develop an area and move all the soil off and plant grass on clay and then wonder why the water ran off and we had water quality issues. And certainly there were lots of reasons each of those steps happened, but that tells you a lack of an appreciation for what that topsoil was doing, even in a developed area under that grass. And it was a very important thing to be able to have. So again, I would love to try and take any questions or comments that you all would have about what we're doing, what I should know, what we should do different. But my job is to say thank you and that I appreciate the work that you're doing. So comments, questions, please.
I live on a farm in Pennsylvania, and like a lot of states, I'm watching a lot of my neighbors having a wicked time right now because of low commodity prices. 2 weeks ago, I rode a bullet train across a large swath of China going 145 miles an hour. As I left Beijing after the first hour, I stopped counting at 470 new 60-story high-rises. In between those high-rises were massive distances of wheat.
What massive what?
Massive distances of wheat.
Of wheat.
He said science is based on good decisions. I know you have no influence over this stupid trade war, but I encourage you to talk to your secretary, to talk to anyone you can. Get on a plane, go to China, meet the Chinese. I've never been there before. They don't want any of the problems of farming that we have now. But you need to see what I saw, because I think you'll have a different perspective of just how successful Trump's policy is.
Appreciate that. So the discussion was, if you heard, the trade war and how destructive that can be, and certainly
We've lost about 8% of our dairy alone this year. New Hampshire lost 16 in the last year, 16%, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is not good.
Yeah.
This trade war is not helping farmers.
Yeah. So the trade situation is a challenging piece, and I guess we got to look at Twitter account today to see what the latest status is, because I don't know. And we're part in the FSA side of trying to soften some of that blow for producers. The question is, how do you avoid the blow altogether? It's been a challenge. As Secretary of Ag for Iowa, I went to China 10 times over that time. I had never been before. And you could see it actually change over those 11 years as well. The continued construction, the national bird of China is the crane, construction crane. And you could see that construction go. And some of those areas that were wheat fields now are cities. They certainly need our agricultural products. And we met with many of those folks over there that were very interested in buying our soybeans, some that were interested in buying beef and other kinds of things. We still struggle with some of the exports. Early on, I was involved in national corn growers and Iowa corn growers. Was president back at a time when we thought we'd be exporting 1 billion bushels of corn a year to China, because we're up to tens of millions, hundreds of millions. They essentially cut that trade off by not approving biotech events, and it was an embargo of sorts to protect their corn industry. Actually, there were some pieces of that, I'm told, that were supposed to change in this agreement that didn't get signed 3 weeks ago, and that we'd be able to get back to that. We don't export poultry products at all because of avian influenza. We lost 30 million layers in the state of Iowa because of avian influenza. It is a real problem. Of course, it came from Asia, it came from China and other places through wild birds, but we still can't export poultry products because of a problem we had here that is actually protecting their industry. So our challenge is, how do we get back those things we had, like pork, like soybeans, like some of our other products, at the same time getting the things that we should have been getting as well. And there were some things. We don't export rice to China, and they have approved it, but they don't let it happen. Beef. It took 15 years to come out of mad cow disease and be able to finally open up beef, and they dribble it in. They could be a huge beef importer. They should be, and that would be a big market for our cattle here. Our beef producers need it absolutely desperately, but we need greater access to that. So this balance, and I don't know, I really don't know whether these tensions will be constructive in getting any of those things fixed, and I don't know how destructive they will be to those things that were working well. So I don't know that. But I think we all recognize how important trade is to the economics of farmers, and if you don't have economics, you also don't even have dollars to take care of the land and the farms the way that you would want to as well. And we see some real economic losses. Now, on top of that, this year, we're seeing a lot of places across the country where we're going to have, one of the reasons we've held the economics together in some places was we had pretty good yields, even though we had bad prices. This year, we're going to have some places that don't have good yields. And we're going to have another round of really tough economics on top of 6 or 7 or 8 years of tough economics. And so whether crop gets in the ground or not, some crop has gotten in the ground in some places in the last week, but we're planting corn the 10th or 8th of June. That's not a recipe for success. And so we've got some real tough times coming. We need those markets. We certainly need them for the markets that we had. We need them for the other markets as well. And I think we have some folks with a lot of that are on the farm that are concerned, as well as folks off the farm. So appreciate your comments. I don't have the magic bullet, but we'll keep talking about how important trade. I would argue the recognition by the Secretary, by the President, that trade was so important to agriculture that there needed to be a market facilitation program payment the first time around, and now the second time around, at least is an appreciation for some of the pain that agriculture feels around trade. The delivery is very inadequate. It's very uneven. It's a blunt instrument to try and deliver payments when markets could do it so much better. We got to get back to markets. I tell you, 3 weeks ago, when there was, it looked like there was a trade deal coming. We thought so much there was a trade deal coming, we had no effort going on to be able to put together any kind of a market facilitation program payment at all, because we thought there was a deal that was going to be signed, and that there were purchase agreements in that, as well as improvements to those products that had been restricted. And things changed. Some things that were in the deal have been pulled out by the Chinese, I'm told, and therefore that didn't get signed. So now we're back into a place where we have this going farther with no prospect right now of gaining some of those things that we needed to gain, as well as getting back those things we needed to get back. So, thank you. Other questions, please?
Well, just a comment. I drove to Lincoln, Nebraska last week, across what would normally be a fruited plain.
Yeah.
The tallest corn I saw on my whole trip was a scruffy glacial outwash in Crawford County, Pennsylvania. And it was about 6 or 8 inches tall. Just not a good idea for this time of year.
No.
It's a little sobering, really.
It is really ugly out there. How many folks are from those areas that are getting, or have a tough time getting stuff in the ground? Raise your hand. Yeah, the first week of June, we had 39% of the corn crop emerged. And we should have some of it, waist high at least. And so even if this crop gets in the ground, there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to say, hey, we got it in the ground. It's okay now. We have a late planted crop that went in bad conditions. Everyone who's a farmer knows that, the kind of conditions you would never think of planting in April, you mud it in June because you're out of time. And the regret and the stress that's on a producer going through this right now, because you look back and you say, well, I had less than perfect conditions back in April, but I should have gone. Well, you shouldn't. 9 times out of 10, this is that one year that maybe you should have if you knew what the future was going to bring. But it's mudded in, it's a mess. We got trenches, we got stuff that's going to be tilled that was always no-till. It just is a mess out there, and it's not set up for a good crop year, even for those folks that get crop in the ground. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Well, I'm thinking about the gentleman next to me and his comments, and I think competitiveness is obviously an issue that is important. So I guess I'm curious, like, how you think, the U.S. can compete with China in terms of their investment. I mean, you said you were over there 11 times, which I've never been there myself. Maybe I'll make it someday. But it sounds like they are, competing, and I don't know that, I don't get the impression, at least, just anecdotally, that, the U.S., I think in a lot of instances, the U.S. kind of takes their advantage for granted. And I guess, how do you see us, how do you see us competing with them?
It's a great question. We have a huge lead on so many places. We have a huge lead on China. Actually, China has about the same number of acres of corn as what the U.S. has. But their production is about 2/3 as much. They struggle in many areas in being as productive, but they have certainly some areas that can be nearly as productive as what our folks are, but they've caught up in many places dramatically because they take great advantage of being able to look at other places. And then right now, they are making huge investments in the places, as government investments and whatever private goes by in China as well, which is government related. But they're making significant investments, much more than we are, in the public science of agriculture and biology than what we are in the U.S. And I would say it's in part because we're comfortable. And we see other needs out there, whether it's health needs and other kinds of needs. And so we underestimate the investment that has got us here, and that investment that we need to be able to stay progressive and ahead. You all know that is a big part of what made the U.S. successful. I would argue we have a great system. We have great education. We got great people, and those are pieces of it too. And some other places are copying those pieces. Some places aren't. But a public investment in science is hugely important, and they're making large investments in that. It is a struggle politically to argue for the kind of investment that we need. And I'd say it's even harder to argue for productivity when we have low prices. As crazy as that is, because it should be about efficiency, right? It should be about creating new and better ways to be able to produce that crop. It's not just about more bushels or more pounds. It's about how inexpensively we can do that, and how in a better way for the use of our resources, we can do that. So it should be especially important when we're struggling economically out here. But it's way easier when you have a short crop and you have high prices to be able to make those arguments than it is right now when you have more crop than it looks like at least creates profitable markets. So I don't know, we have to continue to make that a point. I know the secretary going into the Farm Bill tried to make that a point. Ag research on all the ag groups agenda is in the top 5, but it's always about number 4, number 5. And they have something else that's their lead, and they all are supportive of it, but it never is quite supportive enough to be able to get the extra dollars that we need, even to keep up with what our investments has been, because it's more expensive to be able to do that as well. So I agree. I mean, you all need to get to the real reason that you came here, was to be able to talk to each other, learn from each other, hear from each other. Thank you for what you do and the chance to be able to spend a few minutes with you. Certainly, I am a very fortunate guy to be able to work with a great agency, with great people, a great tradition, an agency that's so important to our farmers across the country from time to time. But a chance, I try when I travel, and we're going to get a few days to be able to get out to some county offices and farms here as well. And I don't think it's just because they route me to the folks that are appreciative, but I also hear from folks that are very appreciative of the work that we do. They'll say, I could not have got those practices done without some cost share and the technology and the engineers and the science behind the work that we got done on that farm. I could not have gotten that beginning farmer loan and started this farming operation without an FSA loan and a farm program that helped me through a disaster. And so we get to work for an agency, a mission area department that is important, even if, and many times, the way we want it is we want to be in the background because the farmers are the lead here, but it's hugely important and they appreciate it. So thank you for your work in doing that. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of it, and certainly love to be able to hear from any time. I just on the web too. On email, bill.northey@usda.gov. So shoot me an email if you have something I should know about. I try and get out and around, but I can't be everywhere and know all the things that I need to know about what we need to do as an agency or the kinds of things that we should be working on. So again, thank you for being here. Have a great rest of the conference. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Somebody with a Hyundai Sonata, where you left the car running, so you're using carbon right now. It's a government plate, anybody?
Oh, government.
A 379-561, your car is running.
All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Limbaugh. He's the 11th Director of the Natural Resources Conservation Service Soil and Plant Science Division. In his role, he provides coordination and leadership to approximately 450 employees in 124 offices across the country, including the National Soil Survey Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. He is also the USDA contact for the UN FAO Global Soil Partnership and serves as co-chair of the Soil Science Interagency Working Group. In 2015, Dave retired as a professor and soil extension specialist with the Department of Soil Science at North Carolina State University, a position he held for 20 years. He has authored and co-authored numerous research and extension publications, including practitioner training materials related to decentralized wastewater, low-impact development issues, hydric soils, hydropedology, and co-authored Soil, Get the Inside Scoop, and another book called No Soil, No Life, which is really cool. I just saw that one. And so they're made for middle and high school age audiences, but I guess the No Soil, No Life is actually being used for introductory soils text at numerous universities, so pretty cool. So welcome to.
All right, let's see if this actually works. So I get to be the first one to use the PowerPoint. Yay me. So I want to talk a little bit about where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed, and really focus more on where we're headed. I want to thank Undersecretary Northey for coming here. I mean, you have an interest in what we're doing, and we all greatly appreciate that. So let's see if we can move forward. So we're going to start with the past, and Jen Mason is going to come on after me, and she's going to give a lot more information about the past. So we're going to use our Wayback Machine and go back to way back 120 years ago, when it all started. So, and I want to point out the modern field equipment that was being used. I think in some places, maybe some of this is still being used, but I do, again, wanted to point out, the field was using test kits. So it has been, this is a science-based organization. It's always been doing that. So yes, we are doing using modern equipment, maybe a little bit more modern now, but some of this is the same. We use stereoscopes, again, and we now have more advanced techniques, but stereoscopes still have their place. They still are useful in what we do. So yes, it's a new technology, but not all new is good. Sometimes the old technology works well. Undersecretary Northey mentioned data handling. And it's important to understand, we do need to handle our data appropriately. We're constantly increasing and improving that, but we've always done this. So this is the past, it is also the present, it is also the future. So let's get into the present. Again, where we are today. Servo Web Soil Survey, it's out there. How many people can use it? Everybody here, I hope. Right? Yay. Okay, so this is kind of the gold standard. Being involved with the Global Soil Partnership, this is what, when you go internationally, people look at and say, wow, this is great. We are probably the only country that has this active survey, that has standards. I was talking with Luis Hernandez, the regional director for this region, who's going to Spain to talk to the folks there about their soil survey and the fact that they don't really have standards. They don't have quality assurance, quality control. That's something that we have that makes our survey that much better. We're now moving, and this is the present, this is not the future. We are moving into the digital soil survey, the raster mapping or grid mapping, whatever the new term will be, so that we can take our polygons that we already have out there, the vectors, and increase the amount of data that's available, so that, as was pointed out, a farmer knows this part of the field is wet, this part of the field is a little drier. We can actually quantify it better, get more information out there for the producer. So going to be based on the field data, the laboratory data, the model data, and have a little bit of uncertainty in there, which is a good thing, so that people know variability. It's important to understand what that variability is. Looking at property layers, so it's not just going to be based on the series, looking at different properties with depth to, again, try to improve our interpretations, improve what is going to be done for the producer. I should also point out, it's not just the agricultural producer or the forester or the range, it's also urban development. So we're in the urban area and coastal. Coastal is also going to be important, as I think we're going to find out maybe a little bit here, right? Maybe a little. All right, so the property layers are going to start with these properties. There may be more added. This is, again, where we are now, what we can do. The idea is that we will always be improving. This is not a static system. This is to always be moving ahead. One of the things I do want to mention, though, as part of our current system is the focus teams. One of the things we've done is put together focus teams that are national. They're not based on states, they're not based on regions, they're national. So first thing, I'm going to embarrass folks here, All of those folks that are leaders of the focus teams, stand. Yeah, I know, I gotta make you work, okay? So we've got a bunch of them in here. Now keep standing, because you're not done yet. Now everybody who's a member of a focus team, stand. All right, so the point is, and for those in the back, you can see it. For those in the front, turn around and look. This is, okay, now you can sit. All right, so the idea is we're trying to get people talking across the nation to work together on these teams. You will hear a lot more from these teams as this conference goes on. There are going to be posters that will be out there, and they've been very effective at getting people working together. So I think this has been a great success that we've had. So let's move to the future. And the future is good, I think. We're going to look 10 years from now. Okay, well, okay, 11 years, I lied. I'm a soil scientist, not a mathematician. So 11 years from now, where will we be? So I want you to think. You now have Soil Web. You can use your phone. You have an app that tells you what soil is there. It tells you based on Web Soil Survey. It gives you a series, gives you the percent that's potentially there. But does it give you instantly all of the information about that soil? Yes or no? Not really. So wouldn't it be great if you could take that information, get those 12 properties with depth, okay, for planning purposes, all 12 of them right there, and then realize that those properties are, for the most part, or at least mostly static. They don't change. But we know that as soon as you start changing your practices on a piece of land, you're going to change certain properties, the dynamic soil properties, changing the organic matter, changing the infiltration, changing those properties that are important to the farmer, to the producer. So we can add that in there. What is the range based on a given practice? How can that affect what you'll eventually get for your yield? Okay? But that's only part of it. Now let's think if you could also tell, what is my moisture content today? Where is my water table today? Will that help the producer? Yes, again, this is audience response. Will that help the producer?
Yeah.
Okay, and again, sometimes you can just go out there and tell. I think, unfortunately, for some of those folks right now, you go out, you know it's wet. But let's think about when it starts getting a little bit dry and you're not walking through mud. How wet is it? How moist is it? How dry is it? I think, can do that. Actually, I don't think we can do it. I know we can do it. It's not going to be easy, but we'll get there. But then if you can go another step, now we know the hydrologic properties. What about knowing what practice would actually move me from this state to a different state? What is the best conservation practice? What is the best land use practice to move from point A to point B? And allow a planner to be able to make those decisions on the fly in the field without having to go back to an office and work through their computer there. Everything right there on a phone. Granted, that might mean we need a little better cell phone coverage, but that's another story altogether. That's outside of our purview. So think about it. This is the Dynamic Soil Survey. And this is actually, I'm putting together a new team that will be looking at the Dynamic Soil Survey, getting this information, putting it all together so that we can move forward in the future, so that we can have that app available. Temporal data, looking at the land use and management component. So here again, we have kind of the start, our original polygon, our vector, our raster properties, but now we're adding in this temporal, this dynamic property that we can change through management. So we can then talk about the hydrology. How is water moving? Where is the water table? And what can we do to help get to this point? The dynamic properties I mentioned, related to the land use, related to the conservation practices. How does it change? If you were a farmer, which one of these two soils would you rather be farming? Okay, the question, it's pretty obvious. But if you're here, how do you get to there? What's the process? What's the practices that can get you there? Okay. The hydrologic component, looking at a watershed. What is the land use across that watershed? How does the land use here affect the land use there? How connected is it? We know, as soil scientists, as ecologists, we know it's all connected. But now to make that connection visible, easily seen so that people can use that information right now. That's what our goal is. Be able to predict. We can go back in time and show the differences in seasonal moisture, but there's a lot of data out there. How much of that can we incorporate into our soil survey, our ecological surveys, and actually use it to start to predict? Forest Service has a bunch of data. Okay, ARS has a bunch of data. Various other entities within NRCS have a bunch of data. Universities have a bunch of data. How much of that is actually talking to each other? How many of those databases talk to each other or can talk to each other? Okay, that's something we have to work on, is get our data so that it's interoperable, so that we can use that information, find out what's out there, tie it together to make it all work. Again, this is not an easy process. It is not a simple process. It is not something that's going to happen next year, unfortunately. But 10 years from now, why not? Why can't we try it? Okay, so again, we can get this for day, any location. That's the goal. Add in the ecological sites, the state in transition. What state are you in? Now, this is maybe not the prettiest version. The edit will have a much better view of that, where we can actually have photographs of various states and then talk about which practice will move us from here to there. And also recognizing at a certain point, once you've gone over a line, you can't get back. So where is that tipping point? Where is the point you don't want to cross? And you may never get back to where you want to be. But it's important to understand that, because if you're dealing with somebody who wants to bring back, restore, and it's not going to be easy, it's going to be costly, expensive, and you may never get there, why are we putting the effort into it? Get as good as you can get, but knowing what the practices will do. Again, but science-based. We have a number of pilot projects. Our research staff in Lincoln, Nebraska is going to be working on this with regions, with states, to take small catchment areas, watersheds, look at what's going on within them, and use that to extrapolate into this dynamic soil survey. First couple are going to be one in Kansas, one in Nebraska, moving in that direction. We're going to expand out to other states. So be prepared, get ready to work with folks. This is where we need to be, and this is how we're going to keep our survey moving forward, giving the information that is needed for our producers. So if we look at what we have today and where we're headed, with our Servo data, we have spatial data, full database. Our gridded Servo does have a use with other raster or gridded data. The digital mapping has additional use, but the key here is to look at the dynamic survey, which gives us this temporal component. How do things change on the short term? Something that we haven't thought a lot about. We know it kind of in the back of our heads, but we want to make sure that people can see it, use that information more effectively. So again, our dynamic soil survey, 10-year time frame. We want to have real-time data used, smartphone. There are a number of things out there now, Land PKS, Soil Web, etc. These are just examples of what we could do, where we could go. Static properties will be part of it. It will still be requiring folks getting out in the field to work on this. All right. Then predicting, where will we be with the conservation practices, land use, etc. So in order to succeed, this is the key part. How are we going to succeed doing this? Okay, audience response. Work harder. Yes, work harder. Right. Okay, yeah, work harder, work longer hours. Not necessarily. Okay, work smarter. I know that's an old kind of Yeah, I know. See, the moaning is there. Yeah, okay. I don't like it. I wanted to say it. It's not working smarter, but it is. Because really what we're talking about is working together. Okay? More partnership. The National Cooperative Soil Survey has been doing this for 120 years. Partnership between NRCS, SCS, universities, other federal agencies, state agencies. This is what we need, is to work together. We can do this. Okay? And it's going to take everybody working together to get to where we need to be. So again, just go back to the goals. 10-year time frame. That is, I think, doable. And I think we have the intelligence, we have the dedication to do that. We have a lot of folks that are interested. Okay, looking at how to get that huge data set onto a smartphone so that somebody can access it. That's going to require a lot more than just the folks here in this room. That is going to require getting our IT specialists working to make this happen. We need the static properties and so forth. So with that, questions, if there are any.
So you talked about the temporal components and showed example of state transition models. Often when we produce those in agency now, we do it for ecological sites, which are more general than soil series. It's a grouping of a lot of similar soil series. And so I'm wondering how you envision reconciling sort of a generalization of the soil properties in order to capture the temporal.
Okay, so the question was, how do we take the general state and transition models and bring them down to that 10 meter or 30 meter pixel, right?
Or even to apply to a very broad range of soil.
So either expanding or contracting. And I think you're gonna love this answer. That's your job, okay? Seriously, you are an ecological site specialist. You're the specialist. This is the vision, okay? So now it's your job to come up with how we do it, okay? I'm not going to claim to be an expert on anything. So, but that's what everybody in this audience does, the field people, okay, the folks that work at various levels. We need that input. So, and I think you can do it. In fact, I know you personally, I know you can do it. So, let's see what you can come up with. Right? Nothing like throwing a question back at you, is there?
One more quick question.
How are we doing on the initial soil survey and our plans for 2026?
We're on track. So the track is to get data out there for all of the unmapped areas so that it can be used for conservation planning. We're on track. We're going to continue to move in that direction. So we will get there. But the key is to understand is that as we're getting to that point, we're also working on this. So we're also getting into the next phase, the next generation of soil survey. So we're not standing still. We're not going to wait to finish one thing and then start something else.
And I would say, we have a lot of traditional users, but don't forget about our unique users. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a call from a detective saying, hey, we're at this site, we're digging. It was we have a witness that says there was a burial over here from 1981. We're digging and, but we don't know if it's natural soil or fill. And, but we're not seeing any rocks. And I'm like, well, that's okay. It could be natural. Well, I said, if you could send me a picture of the soil profile with, tape measure next to it, I'll let you know. So he shot me the email, told him, he called me right away. I'm like, it's natural soil. You're good. You're good. So, and then I shared the web soil survey with them and imagery from 1985. Where'd you find that? So we can educate our unique users too. Next, I'd like to introduce Jen Mason. She's an MLRA soil survey project leader in Clinton, Tennessee. located approximately 25 miles north of Knoxville. She was born and raised on a small beef cattle farm in the, how do you say that? Sequatchie Valley. Okay, Sequatchie Valley and Anticline in the center of the Cumberland Plateau. She has 2 daughters, 4 and 8, and her favorite soul series is Waynesboro, established in 1913, not 18. Thank you, Jim. Welcome.
Okay, Jim, I'm going to try to do this from here. The squirrely mouse. See if that does. It's kind of bigger than it is on the other screen. But what I did was a story map today. I was the lead of the National Cooperative Soil Survey Focus Team for around 3 years, I think. Jim Thompson from West Virginia University is here. Raise your hand. Is one of my team members. Former resourceful scientist Meredith Albers from Salt Lake City. She left the agency to move to France. That was really nice. And Linda Green out of the National Soil Survey Center. Last year, we decided to merge with the Outreach and Focus team because we had achieved one of our primary accomplishments was to increase the branding and visibility of the National Cooperative Soil Survey. As you can see, we adopted our logo, which we're really proud of. Sarah Odgers, who used to work for West Virginia University, donated that and all the rights to that to us. So we're really, really happy with the logo and increasing visibility. 120 years, we're not like Queen Elizabeth. We don't have the Diamond Jubilee just yet, but we're getting there. We're past it probably. There are 2 publications that I really gleaned one from the David Rice Gardner thesis from Harvard University called the National Cooperative Soil Survey, and the Profiles in the History of the U.S. Soil Survey, which is a true cooperative product. This was edited by Douglas Helms and Ann Eflin and Patricia Durana. This is a great publication. It had contributors from the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Ag Extension, universities. It's an excellent publication, and that was sent to a lot of the offices back in the day when that was published. Beginning with David Rice Gardner, he did notate in the beginning of his thesis, there were 2 publications in the early 1800s. 1820 in Albany, New York, published a similar publication to this one in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. The reason why he notates this is, you see here, we're going across the United States, in the Ingersolls. The final report of Geology of Massachusetts was one of the first of its kind in addition to the publication in 1820. It connects agriculture, geology, soils to the user. And they start to classify these soils into categories early on. They discuss heavily applications of fertilizers. They discuss applications of potash. They discuss so much that connects to the user. So we're seeing early connections of science-based information to the public as early as 1820 and 1830. This is a pretty amazing publication, actually. Moving forward, the infamous Edgar Hilgard out of Mississippi. He becomes a really strong figure later on in the National Cooperative Soil Survey. In fact, he had a bit of a rift with Milton Whitney. As you see, we go to Jackson, Mississippi. If you read this publication, The State Geologist of Mississippi, this is one of the early efforts back to geology, soils, and vegetation. This is the early precursor to our current ecological site descriptions. And it takes this information back again to the farmer, straight to the farmer. This was a really good publication, by the way. Sorry, I'm having problems with my mouse. Finding the cursor here. If I can grab it. It goes on here. It says Hilgard's understanding of the principles underlying use of soil surveys and other research was in 1860, many years in advance of the development of techniques of soil characterization, soil analysis, and field mapping. He was ahead of his time, folks, really far ahead of his time. And it gives here laboratory data in conjunction with the vegetation communities. And takes, again, the goal of this was to take this straight to the user. There's some critical steps that happened, not directly under the umbrella of the Cooperative Soil Survey, but these are the what if they didn't happen. You had the Morrill Act of 1862. It's passed establishing the land-grant colleges, providing federal lands to the states to be sold to support colleges in agriculture and mechanical arts. This is a copy of Justin Morrell's proposal. Then you have the Hatch Act of 1887, which gave federal funds of $15,000 each to state land-grant colleges. So you've got these actions, the what-ifs, and then you come down to, this is a big key here, the Association of American Colleges and Experiment Stations in the U.S. Weather Bureau. These guys really, meetings like what we do here today, if they hadn't talked, if they hadn't met as many times as they did and discussed the need for soil survey, where would we be? There were major players across the United States, especially the eastern United States and in the southern United States. Then we have the establishment, the Second Morrill Act of 1890s. The importance of the 1890s, it takes the black colleges across the United States, one of our major employers, the universities, with their land grant, 1890s land grants, even outside of that land grant realm now, they employ the bulk of who we are in this room and across the nation. What would we have done without the research? And just the employment alone, these minds that come together and are hired by Soil Survey. And I'll refer to Soil Survey throughout this because we've changed our name several times. Just a wee bit, right? Bureau of Soils. This opens the door for the black colleges. And Prairie Valley had a really great table as far as most of these. It's interesting, Tuskegee was created by an act of Alabama legislator 12 years later, and they incorporated the Board of Trustees, named as private. And not a land grant college, but there's some strange facts there that you normally didn't think of, 1899. So Prairie Valley has a really great website here. The 1890 Instruction Extension Tuskegee came into existence in the following sequence. And then you have the timeline here. In addition, you have the University of District of Columbia and the University of Virgin Islands with a map of the locations of these universities here. So without those steps, where would we be as far as employment today? Back again to the Association of American Colleges and Experiment Stations. Currently, their name has changed several years ago to the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, the 5th Annual Convention. This was the big meeting of the minds. The 5th meeting, I think 5th Annual Convention in Washington, D.C., you've got two big players here. Not that there weren't other players. I.P. Roberts, New York, and C.W. Dabney of University of Tennessee, and the Vice President Association at the time, leading to their discussions at this convention without meeting, talking for the need of their work at the Ag Experiment Stations, came to the Agricultural Appropriations Act of 1894, where Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, C.W. Dabney from the University of Tennessee, recommended the Secretary of Agriculture that the Division of Agricultural Soils be established March the 3rd of 1894. I messed my date up there, 1894. I know, I'm telling you. So, 1984, right? So I messed my date up. Milton Whitney was appointed by Dabney as the Chief of the Division of Agricultural Soils. So here we go. The meeting of the minds, and look what happens when people just get together and talk. That's as simple as that. Just getting together, sharing information, talking creates action, talking creates the need. It comes together in strange ways. So in 1899, the National Cooperative Soil Survey, David Rice Gardner gives credit to Milton Whitney for forming this and seeing the need. Now, granted, there were rivalries across the nation. Hildegard, Sauer Hawkins, University of Illinois, they had so many differing ideas as far as what we need to look at as soils. Hildegard and Hawkins were on the soil chemistry end. Milton Whitney was with soil texture. And if they would just thought for a second, all their ideas were fabulous. You know, you just got to bring them together, and eventually they will. So we had the first work of the National Cooperative Survey, and there's a lot going on in 1899, more so than you think. And I'm not going to do the who's on first speech on this one because there was so much going on. You have the Agricultural Experiment Record in 1898, 1899 coming out. There was a section, Water and Soils, the soils of Tennessee. This is a preliminary report. The soils of Tennessee, and it says in there that it commits 6 years prior to the publication of 1898 and 1899. So you could argue either way on who's on first. So they looked at This is one of your first collaborative efforts, and look at what we have right here. Who's involved with this? The Agriculture Experiment Station, USGS, Division of Soils. One of your first publications were more than a map, right? One of the things I have today is we go far beyond a map. So this was some of the first research in soils looking at erosive properties in Tennessee. They also published the soil map across the state, which they said was 10 feet by 4 inches long, 10 inches wide, which was prepared by the cooperation of the USGS. And there you see the cover of that. And the mechanical analysis was actually conducted by Milton Whitney of the department. Chemical analysis was by J.B. McBride of the Ag Experiment Station of 15 samples. And it goes in here, and the links can go to each county. I'm not going to do that today. So this goes into the geologies and the soils across the state of Tennessee, many in eastern Tennessee where we reside. Here you go right here. Again, back to the value. The first publication is pre-cooperated, pre-NCSS. I talk about the connection of the geology, the soils to the user. Back again, we're here to the user. And one of the first things out of the bat in this publication they hit is the agricultural value and the best methods of management. Different soils are very fully discussed. So they're really hitting the farmer right here. And they're hitting this hard, the value of their work, the value of cooperation, the value of partnership. So if you didn't have division and the Ag Experiment Stations working together, you wouldn't have had the data coming out of these early cooperative partnerships. My lines are doing weird stuff in this. It's so strange how it's different from computer to computer. So at the same time, first soil surveys of the National Cooperative Soil Survey, we all know Cecil County, Maryland, Connecticut, Massachusetts concentrate on tobacco lands. I love these old surveys. I'm a total map dork, right? Look at that map. It's gorgeous. And the pen and ink drawings that come with this of the Cecil series. Franklin, some of your first landscape pictures here. Pen and ink. Why are my lines crammed together? Connecticut Valley, Connecticut and Massachusetts discovered both areas. Again, these are hitting the agricultural value, different farming practices prior to tobacco. This is really concentrating on tobacco growth. Around 1899, the same time period, we're looking at soil surveys in the western United States. If you read a book called Crisscross Trails by Macy Latham, he was an early soil surveyor for the Bureau of Soils. It's actually a funny book. If you guys got to read that book, it's actually comical. But it chronicles actually agricultural changes. The West was changing from the Wild West to settling down into agricultural times. And the changes in agriculture and the simple decisions that people made to change what they were cropping. These guys were looking at different properties than the surveys in the East. They were looking at what they called then the alkali properties. And they were looking at what we can do, what happens to these soils when we heavily irrigate them for crop production. So this is where this survey was going in a slightly different direction, but again, they saw the value to the farmer. Early geomorphic drawings here in this survey were fabulous. They had flow maps with water flow, almost similar to looking at which way the water was flowing and where it would carry different certain properties of the soil once they irrigated it. This is a map here. This took place close to the Roswell area and covered a couple of states. Sorry, my mouse is going nuts. So we have that there. Now we're coming down into here. So about that time period, early 1900s, people start to see the beginning of our products. And they start to see these surveyors, once these early surveys were completed, started to map the first erosion phases in the United States. This is the precursor to Hugh Hammond Bennett. We're looking at erosion phases, especially in the eastern United States, and he says here identified large areas of gully land in Fairfield County, South Carolina in 1911. So then people start seeing these soil surveys being published, and they're thinking, wait a minute, this goes far beyond the agricultural realm. In 1912, the National Tax Association recognized soil survey data for use in tax assessment. We can get something out of this, right? Because hey, taxpayers, here we go. We can get something. And then precursor to World War I, and as David Rice Gardner says, a lot of this is grossly oversimplified for presentation purposes. Post-war inflated wheat prices and the beginnings of the Dust Bowl. So we're identifying erosion phases across the United States at this time. We're starting to see massive issues with plowing, with practices that aren't exactly best management practices. And then we have World War I on the cusp of this. Again, oversimplified. And this statement was interesting. This comes straight from David Rice Gardner, because the demands of World War I, the price more than trebled. With characteristic lag, inelastic supply response, however, major increases in wheat production came largely after the armistice and carried over into the immediate post-war years. The above is an oversimplified situation involving other commodities, weather conditions, non-farm price levels, etc. But the net result was a sharp and prolonged break in farm price when worldwide demand diminished after 1920. You've got that problem, but farmers are still producing, they're still plowing. And then we get the perfect storm that comes in with the Dust Bowl. During this time, I didn't mention earlier, George Coffey tried to establish taxonomic standards with this little survey, didn't get much farther. And I'm going to mention this because this comes in a little bit later. C.F. Marbut starts to begin soil classification efforts to continue what Coffey did earlier on. But other things start to take precedence, and it all comes back to erosion. Again, we look at areas that are looking at soil surveys for other uses. Interpretations become specialized. We start to see the need for interpretations across the United States other than agriculture here. Broad land use application interpretations. Michigan did a land economic survey. And I saw, excuse me, where a publication called the Ames Forester saw this publication, they saw this survey, and the Ames Forester called it, quote unquote, peculiar. So I think people have been seeing soil scientists as kind of weird from early on, right? So Cooperative Soil Survey, and the Michigan State Agencies, USGS, Bureau of Soil, came together to do a basic inventory, resource with economic analysis, word jargon there. In the field, they had teams of foresters together, they had geologists, soil surveyors, and they prepared the map showing the soil's topography, water, geology cover, and land use. So you're taking a lot of the past work and bringing it together here with these ideas start to accumulate. They probably took from Hillgard, they probably took from those early geology publications, that they're combining this for one use. And if you go to a place called Sicking, Michigan, they have this map as an interactive map. And it's a fabulous map, by the way. So we're looking at efforts beyond the agricultural product, the basic inventory. 1925, the Bureau of Reclamation. In the West, after a large number of large-scale irrigation reclamation projects had failed for lack of adequate data on soils, some of the employees of the Soil Survey were assigned to advise the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Again, we're starting to see this looking to soil science to produce products to benefit other federal agencies, not just the taxpayer, not just the agricultural producer here. So they did correlative studies, and this, they also come back to the value. This was pretty funny. I had to laugh pretty hard on this. Scattered locations across the country. A start was made on correlative soil studies, relations to specific soil types, to the occurrence of various plants, animal diseases, and infestations. These included alkali disease, corn borer, pyrexia, disease of livestock, and the quality of human teeth. So if anybody ever asks you why what you do is important, it's your teeth, right? Soils are coming back to your teeth. Real quick, TVA was a big player early on in our cooperators, and this is a huge presentation. I've not been able to really, we just don't have the time for it. You have the Soil Erosion Service. TVA produced a large number of surveys in the eastern United States, eastern Tennessee, largely eastern Tennessee where we are, and Virginia. You have the Soil Conservation Service, and here, I really want to talk about this real quick before we close. Thinking outside the box. At the time, C.F. Marbut really wasn't bent on soil erosion as a nationwide problem within the soil division. Hugh Hammond Bennett was a soil scientist, came from the University of North Carolina. Can anybody guess what Hugh Hammond Bennett's first job was? Where was he? Nashville, Tennessee, Davidson County in 1903. I heard somebody say Nashville somewhere. Looking at these erosive properties across the nation, seeing the problems. And one thing where he hadn't been, it went outside the box. He was a talker. He was a mover, he was a shaker. He could take the science to the public, he could turn around and take that same science and sell it to the politicians. He was so good at that. And without that gift of gab from the South, where would we be today, right? I know, he was a talker. So I've got to go. Anyway, cut off. Getting to that point, and over the years, we have so many projects across the nation of Collaborative. It goes, we're more than a map. Without that camaraderie, without that friendship, without the relationships that's been built over 120 years, you wouldn't have the map here today with the soilers map. So here we go. So the future has a lot to bring with it. We have a lot of work to do still, but without that camaraderie, without that work, we wouldn't have gotten this map, much less a lot of the products that Dave mentioned before and the basis to go for the future. Any questions?
No question.
Sorry, Grace. Sorry. Oh, wait. I'm going to take my...
Yes, some of us have the gift of gab. I do not, but I have been asked, so what do you do for work? And I'll say soil scientist, and it always comes back, soil scientist? Soil? And I'm like, no, soil scientist. Well, what do they do? And I'm like, I got to think quicker and be like, well, what do you think a soil scientist does? Like, I don't know what that is. Like Game of Thrones or something. I don't know. Walking Dead, soil scientist. Anyway. Since 2017, Maggie Payne has been working with NRCS as a soil scientist, rapid carbon assessment coordinator, conservation planner, GPR operator, and wetland determination coordinator in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. She's currently a resource soil scientist in Wareham, Mass. She received her master's degree at the University of Rhode Island studying subaqueous solids. Awesome. And water quality in Narragansett Bay. Her favorite great group is Samoquents and Samawasents. And it says here she nearly convinced her nearly convinced her family to add a silent P before her youngest son Sam's name. That's a good story. So, please welcome Maggie Payne.
I figured only this crowd would get that joke. Anyway, I was asked to talk today a little bit about the Coastal Zone Soil Survey. Through this Coastal Zone Soil Survey story map that I put together, because we're here in the ocean state of Rhode Island, and so we're going to have a little overview of this. Basically, what this story map is it's just a really brief overview of what Coastal Zone Soil Survey is and why it's important. I really like this story map format because it incorporates maps, which we all love to look at, but it also gives you the ability to put in some nice sort of plain language, some really nice photographs, and it can be a really good tool to talk to the general public. Like Debbie said, somebody that asks you, what do? You can say, go look at this. This is sort of why this is important and why we do what we do. I think so much of what we do in soil survey is, we're really good at collecting a lot of data. We have all of these databases. We have this huge database of soil survey information. But then sometimes it gets lost. Why is this important? And why is what we do important to the general public and to people that can use this information? And so that's sort of the reason that I put this together. And especially in these coastal zone areas, we're often working with people that are totally unfamiliar with soil survey as it is. And so having something to point them to be able to point to why are we working in coastal areas, why are soil scientists on the water, is an important thing for us to have. And so in the beginning of this map, I just have sort of an overview of what is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Cooperative Soil Survey, and then a nice map of where we have a lot of these coastal zone projects. So all of these little dots are either proposed or in progress or completed projects that were done in the coastal zone. I'm going to zoom in. The nice thing about these story maps is you can zoom right in and look in more detail if you want to. So here's a project right here in Rhode Island that was completed, the Coastal Zone Soil Survey of Rhode Island. And you can also look right at the soil survey that's available, and you can see what was mapped there. And so it's a nice ability to, if you want to go a little bit deeper and read about those things. I'm going to just scroll through this. Let's see. I guess we'll navigate through this. So why are we working in the coastal zone? Basically, we're there because this is where a lot of people live in the coastal zone. In the 2010 census, they found out that 39% of the U.S. population actually lives in counties right adjacent to the coastline. This represents less than 10% of our actual land area. And so 10% of our land area, we have almost 40% of people living there. That's a lot of people that are interested in these areas, a lot of use of these lands. And so it's an important place for us to have good soil survey information. And so that's why we're there. It's often not until we have some of these major coastal disasters or we're talking about sea level rise that it becomes obvious that we maybe don't have adequate information on these coastal zone areas. So this is an example for Superstorm Sandy on the East Coast back in a few years ago now, when we had major disasters along a lot of the coasts. And it sort of became obvious that our soil mapping in some of these areas was really inadequate for some of the interpretations that we're trying to make. And so that's one of the reasons that we're trying to work in these areas. So what is a coastal zone soil survey? Basically what we're looking to do is go have a seamless soil survey from what we have on the land, going through the coastline, including salt marshes, including barrier beaches. This is a block diagram that just kind of shows that interface where we have the terrestrial soils up here over our glacial tills, and then going into a coastal lagoon, mapping our underwater soils, and then up over the barrier beach and including salt marshes, and then grading out into the deeper ocean areas. So close that. And so that's basically what a coastal zone soil survey entails when we talk about that. And again, why are we in these coastal areas? There's a lot of people that live there, but it's also a habitat that is really important for us to protect. So we have prime agricultural soils on the terrestrial lands. We also have really agricultural soils underwater. There's a lot of aquaculture that goes on. We work with, USDA works with a lot of these aquaculture growers now. Eelgrass is a really important habitat in these shallow water areas that is important for a lot of our commercial fisheries. A lot of the young fish grow up in these eelgrass habitats. And so knowing what the substrate, what the soils in these areas are, and how we can assess those is really an important thing. So what we've done through Coastal Zone Soil Survey, we've done a lot of mapping in some of these areas, but in order to get the message across about why is this important, we went through and developed some of the interpretations and interpretive maps for various things, and I'll just briefly go through some of those interpretations that we've developed. Like I said, we can make these maps and say, well, this is a Pisciqua soil, and that doesn't really tell most people much about that soil. Anybody that doesn't know what that means. But in order to do that, what we do is we'll put together these interpretations that allows people to say, well, I'm interested in planting eelgrass, or I'm an aquaculture grower. Where should I go in this pond? And that's where we can provide some really good information. So some of those interpretations include aquaculture. Like I said, we work with USDA, NRCS works with a lot of these aquaculture growers. They're considered our subaqueous livestock in some of these coastal counties. And so we can use these soil surveys to make a map of where is the prime habitat for growing out these, like this is hard shell clam, or we've also developed, let me go to the next one. Interpretations for the oyster restoration or oyster reef formation. So we've made these interpretive maps where you can say, well, these areas are highly suitable. This is one of our coastal ponds here in Rhode Island. The green areas are much more suitable for putting these oyster reefs out. We're spending a lot of money in getting people to put out and put in these oyster reefs. Let's make sure we're putting them in the right spot and not putting them in an area that's not going to be suitable. And this is an example of one of our oyster reef restorations here in Rhode Island. And then after the fact, this provides some good habitat for those oysters to grow out. Eelgrass is another thing that's important in these areas. So like I said, this provides a lot of habitat for a lot of the young fish species. And knowing there's been a loss of eelgrass habitat over the past number of years, and so there's a lot of efforts in replanting eelgrass areas. And that's always been a data gap, I guess, of not knowing, well, what is the substrate and what substrate is the best for replanting this eelgrass. Again, people are putting in lots of money into replanting eelgrass. Let's make sure they have the best information on what the substrates are and for the most success in these restoration efforts. Another important aspect in mapping these coastal and subaqueous areas is looking at blue carbon accounting. So blue carbon is the carbon that's stored in coastal ecosystems. We're focused obviously on the carbon in the soils in these coastal ecosystems. So it includes salt marshes, it includes those eelgrass beds and any other subaqueous soils. And so there's a lot of carbon stored in these soils, and we can make a map now that we have these seamless surveys. So this is the terrestrial soils up in the north here and grading into the coastal lagoon soils down here. And so you can look at how much carbon is actually stored in these soils across an entire landscape. My mouse is just barely working. And one of the final interpretations that we've developed, so this is more relevant to what's happening up on the coast, but a lot of these soils, they're developed in subaqueous saline environments, and they have a lot of sulfides in them. When you pull them out of that environment, bring them up on the soil surface, they can create acid sulfate soils, which can be a really low pH. And these soils are often used in like beach replenishment or dune replenishment activities. And if you're not aware that there is going to be this sulfide issue, we can have major issues with trying to plant and regrow these beach grasses. So this is an example of a dune replenishment activity here, and they planted the beach grass. But if you have these sulfidic soils, the beach grass is not going to survive. The pH is going to just get too low. And so letting people know this is a concern. Make sure you're aware of what soils you're pulling out from these subaqueous environments and what's going to happen to them once you bring them up on land is another important interpretation that we've developed. And so I just conclude this story map with just again a quick overview of what is soil survey and what we do through the soil survey and the National Cooperative Soil Survey. And finally, of course, how to access our soil survey data is always an important thing to add at the end. So we've got a link to our web soil survey and also the soil web app here at the end of the story map. So basically, I just developed this story map as an online tutorial for the everyday person. When I'm talking to people that want to know what we do and why we're working in these coastal zone areas, I can just point them to this and say, well, this is why it's important to know this information. And I like the aspect that we can also incorporate those maps into it too. And hopefully we'll continue to update those where our projects are and the progress of those subaqueous and coastal zone projects in the future. Does anybody have any questions?
We can take one question.
Yeah.
Is eelgrass a single species, and are those plant communities single, are they monocultures?
It depends on where in the country you are, but We have a species of eelgrass in the northeast is what I'm most familiar with. Zostera marina, is that how it is?
Yeah, and there's a Zosteropalooza that we go to as
Yes.
well and attend, because they are actually looking for, all things being equal, they want to go, water quality wise, they want to go look at the sediment or the soil to see where to, what's happening and where to plant.
But there are, the general term is seagrasses, so there are a few other species of seagrasses. Eelgrass is the most common one around here. There might be other experts in the audience that would know more about that than me. Any other questions, I guess? Yeah.
So these environments seem they're stable, but relatively soil scientists, deep soil science, they have the potential of changing quite rapidly with the storm event or saltwater intrusion or what have you. So what are the thoughts about this static data, maintaining this data throughout time? Because as soil survey, it's like a 30-year, it's always historically been about a 30-year update. These seem like the potential for them to change is pretty high.
I think in certain areas there is a potential for change. I mean, we've already seen it. I work in an area that covers the coast all along Cape Cod, and even our terrestrial soil. I mean, the soil survey that we have right now, the coast is just the coastline is way off. I'm a proponent of even just going in and changing that more often than every 30 years, because people look at our data and they say, well, it's, why are you mapping this soil and now it's all water? Probably the rest of this data is not going to be any good either. So I'm a proponent of just updating those things. But there has been research. I mean, when we started this initiative with looking at underwater soils, that was one of the things that people said, well, this changes all the time. Like every year it's going to be different. And we did, there's a paper published, I think Mike Bradley published a paper on that it actually doesn't change as much as you might think in most areas. There's definitely those really dynamic parts of these subaqueous and coastal zones, but in the subaqueous environment, it's pretty stable, and the topography and those soils are staying pretty consistent over the course of time.
I would just interject. Remember your master's degree in Little Narragansett Bay? We looked at NOAA data from 1960s, and then you did the bathymetry in the early 2000s, and they were quite alike. So
yes, it's not as dynamic as some people would think.
And we could call out landforms and landscapes in these areas. Thank you, Maggie. So we're definitely still learning a lot about subaqueous soils and coastal zone soil surveys and what are the needs, what are the uses, and we're trying to push, conservation practices in these areas. I mean, really, this whole coastal zone soil survey was started from universities doing the work in these areas, and we just jumped on board, And thank God we have university staff. We can call and email, and they reply back to us, maybe with 5 research papers to read and homework or something, but, they get back to us. So next, I'd like to introduce John Mcniff. He was born and raised in Rhode Island and is a ranger with the National Park Service at the Roger Williams National Memorial in Providence, Rhode Island. He attended Rhode Island College and received his bachelor's in history with a minor in anthropology. He also received his master's in anthropology, specializing in archaeology from Binghamton University. He has been a historical reenactor since the mid-70s, first with the Kentish Guard and then with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment of the Continental Line. For the last 20 years, he's been a reenactor of the nautical aspects of Rhode Island history as a privateer and pirate. He has also consulted, worked on, and appeared in several films about the colonial period, and particularly dealing with the early colonial history of Rhode Island. Please welcome John Mcniff.
Can everyone hear me? Yay. My name's John Mcniff. I'm a ranger with the National Park Service at the Roger Williams National Memorial. I want to give you folks some background about this little place that we call home, this place, Rhode Island. Providence was founded in 1636 by Roger Williams. That in and of itself doesn't mean that much. To understand what that means, we have to go back a little bit in history, going back in England. Why did all these English people leave England and come over and start these colonies over here? Let's go back to Henry VIII. You all remember him, right? Had 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. He was not supposed to be king. He had an older brother. Henry VIII was an athlete. He was the best tennis player in England. Might be because he was the prince, but he was the best tennis player in England. In a world where most people were 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", Henry was 6'2". He also was involved in a sport that people don't necessarily want to participate in today because it's really dangerous. He was a jouster. You know, when people get on horseback in armor with a shield and a long pole and try and knock somebody else off the horse, that was one of his favorite sports. But this Henry VIII, when his brother died, he ends up marrying his brother's wife, Catherine, Princess of Spain, and leads his kingdom. Wonderful king of England, solid, good to get things done, has a daughter, Mary. So Henry, Catherine, Mary. It was absolutely wonderful. And that goes on for a good long time, except for one thing. Because of the history in England, the struggles and civil war and problems of trying to have an heir to the throne, Henry wants a son. And because of the kind of guy that Henry was, he blamed Catherine for not giving him a son. So Henry writes to the Pope and seeks a divorce. Small problem. The Pope is Catherine's uncle. Pope writes back, sorry, no can do. Henry, being the kind of person he is, says, okay then, we're going to take England and split it away from the Roman Catholic Church, and I will now be the new leader of the Church of England, and everyone in England must now become a member of the Church of England. We'll seize the Catholic properties, we'll seize the monasteries, the lands, the incomes, and everything else, and give them out to our friends. Some people were not pleased. But this went on. Henry had another wife, had a daughter, Elizabeth. That marriage didn't work out. Eventually, Henry did have a son, Edward. And Henry did not live forever. So when Henry dies, Edward becomes king. Now, Edward did not so much like the Church of England. He certainly didn't like the Roman Catholic Church. He liked the church from up north, the Presbyterian Church. So now everybody in England must now become a member of the Presbyterian Church, whether you liked it or not. The properties were seized back from Henry's friends, given to Edward's friends. But Edward was only on the throne for a short time. When Edward died, Henry's first daughter, Mary, becomes queen. Mary was Roman Catholic. Remember, her uncle was the Pope. Everybody in England must now go back to the Roman Catholic Church, whether you like it or not. As a matter of fact, anybody that received property that once belonged to the Roman Catholic Church is corrected in their behavior. This includes execution. Anybody that doesn't like what Mary is doing is corrected in their behavior. This is, again, executions. Mary did this so much that she received a nickname. Anybody? Bloody Mary. And luckily for England, Mary was not on the throne very long. When she died, Henry's other daughter, Elizabeth, becomes queen. Elizabeth doesn't like the Roman Catholic Church, certainly doesn't like the Presbyterian Church, wants to be seen as a strong, independent leader for England. So she wants to hearken back to her father. So now everyone in England must now rejoin the Church of England, whether they like it or not. Elizabeth is queen for a good long time, almost 50-some years. During this time, more and more religious factions start popping up that don't want to become necessarily hardcore members of the Church of England. One of them in particular is a group that wanted to fix the Church of England. They wanted to get rid of all the trappings of the Roman Catholic Church, the vestments, the holidays, the saints, the symbols, the ceremonies, and get it back to its pure heart, the center of what it was really all about. They wanted to purify that Church of England. And the nickname they got was the Puritans. Other religious factions start popping up all over the place. Elizabeth was getting old. Because she maintained that image of the strong, independent woman, she never married, so she had no legitimate heirs. This was going to be a problem for England. People were getting scared. But Elizabeth had a cousin. He happened to be King of Scotland, just to the north, King James VI of Scotland. And James VI was a very savvy politician, and he started making deals with all these different religious groups, saying, if you support me, I'll make sure you don't get punished when I become king. If you support me, all of you, the Catholics, the Protestants, the Presbyterians, the Church of England, everybody, if you support me to become the next king, you will not be punished when I become king. Are you with me? They believe. In 1603, Elizabeth dies. James VI is summoned down from Scotland. He becomes James I of England. And one of the first things he does is he breaks every single one of those agreements. The Roman Catholics were really upset. Within 2 years, they had a plan to destroy the English government, blow up Parliament, kill the royal family, and install the Princess of Spain as the next Queen of England. At the last minute, it was caught. A person by the name of Guy Fawkes on November 5th, 1605. He was tortured. He gave up his co-conspirators, and this massive conspiracy was found. They were executed. The prosecutor in the case was Sir Edward Coke, one of the leading jurists of England. And it's around this time that a child is born in London to the son of a merchant tailor and an innkeeper, Roger Williams. All of this kind of intrigue, because everybody is spying on everybody. All this intrigue and politics being played out on every level, whether it's household, whether it's community, whether it's business, everybody is spying on everybody, because if you can get a leg up on one little bit, you'll be all set. Oh, merchant tailors. In London, the merchant tailor isn't just somebody that sells you clothes. The merchant tailor is the one that makes the bespoke suits for the people at court and at Parliament. They're the fancy tailors. They're the ones that have the nobility come to them, measure them out, and make the silk suits. That's the household that Roger Williams grew up in. And during the process of all of this, he is taken under the wing of that very same Sir Edward Coke, sent to Charterhouse School, where he learns his grammar, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, so he can study well. Roger is sent to court, to Parliament, and to the Star Chamber, where he takes notes for Sir Edward Coke. He's part of that network of people keeping an eye on everybody else, writing down speeches in a way that's just disappeared by now, shorthand. And I have no doubt that walking up and down the corridors at court, he is also writing notes about what people are saying about everyone else in shorthand. So if he's discovered, it's just scribbles on a piece of paper. Sir Edward Coke sends Roger to Cambridge University, where he's educated. Originally going up there to study the law, Roger Williams finds out that no matter what he does, he doesn't come from the right status background to actually make it as a life as a lawyer in England. So he switches to theology, falls in love with the faith, and sees how it's been abused over the last century, if you would, by being a political tool. If you wanted to be a good English person, with every change of monarch, you had to keep changing religions. And these Puritans, some had left England, and in 1631, Roger and others leave and come to the New World over here. His friends had already set up the towns of Boston and Salem. Plymouth had been set up 10 years before. Now, Plymouth were a bunch of separatists. They wanted to break entirely from the Church of England. They were a little bit different than Puritans. But Roger comes to Boston. He sees his friends now. To get across that ocean, it's a 2-month sea voyage. Think about what you guys are doing 2 months ago. It's not that far from St. Patrick's Day, so use that as a reference point. All the food that you've had to drink since St. Patrick's Day till today Dried, smoked, salted, packed into wooden barrels, put in the bottom of the ship. Everything you've had to drink, day or night, from St. Patrick's Day until today, put into wooden barrels and put in the bottom of the ship. You're wearing the same clothes, day and night, from St. Patrick's Day till today. You've got an area that's, well, not a lot bigger than this stage area right here with 100 people in it. And none of you have had a bath since St. Patrick's Day. How many people have spent time on a boat? What happens to your clothing? It gets wet. They're wearing wool and linen. You know what wet wool smells like? Not only have they not had a bath, but they all smell like wet dogs. Have we had any bad weather since St. Patrick's Day? A storm on land isn't that bad. It knocks tree branches down, rattles the windows, and then it moves out to sea. That same storm out on the ocean lifts the ocean up. You're on a boat. It gets knocked around the same way a cat plays with a mouse. What was the deck is now the bulkhead, and you are dancing around inside there. Everything is getting wet, including the food that was stored at the bottom of the boat. What happens to dried, salted, or smoked food if it gets wet and sits there for a month? Yeah. There's no place to stop to get new food, so those are your rations. Half of you are feeling sick because you've been on land your whole life, have never been out to sea. And now, when you get across to this new world, think about what that word means. In England, just this last winter, in February, they had severe winter weather warnings for London. Temperatures going below freezing. And expecting in between 1 and 3 centimeters of snow. Beware, there will be traffic delays and train delays. That's winter, severe winter in London. A friend of mine got married at Cambridge 3 summers ago, in July. It was beautiful. They were planning a nice outdoor wedding ceremony on one of the lawns of the colleges. People would be coming in, but England was suffering from a heat wave. It was so bad that comics on TV were making fun of how hot it was. And the day of the wedding comes, and they're worried that people will be passing out from the heat. You know how hot it was? 75. 2 months to get across that ocean. You come here to this new world. You have a different environment altogether. You have everything's different. In England, they have a nice little red deer. It's about this big. Okay, it's a little bit bigger than a Great Dane. Here we have moose. You go for a walk in England, the only thing you have to fear are other people. Over here, there are rattlesnakes, cougars, bears, wolves, and other people. Roger comes into Boston. They're his friends. They all come over here for the same reason, because they don't want to be punished, because they don't want to become parts of the Church of England. They want to be able to follow their own faith, except the Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up by people, 25 to 30-year-old guys that knew that they were right. Ever have an argument on Facebook? It's about the same thing. You can't argue with them. Roger saw this as being a blank slate where you could start from scratch and not recreate the mistakes of England, whereas these guys came over here knowing they were right and knowing that they had to make it their religious theocracy. Roger said, you're recreating the same mistakes in England. It's just label changing. This is the thing that's called the bloodshed throughout the centuries. And he leaves Boston and he goes up to Salem. He becomes a preacher up there because they're a little bit more liberal in Salem. But Boston puts pressure on them. And they force Salem to get rid of Roger Williams. Roger goes to the only other English settlement here in New England, goes to Plymouth. He becomes the teacher there and the minister. And one of the things that he starts preaching is it's not right for a minister to be paid. That makes you a mercenary. So Roger needs a job. He's a city boy from London. He doesn't know how to fish. He doesn't know how to hunt. He doesn't know how to farm. What he does know how to do is trade. So he takes a whole bunch of English goods, goes out among the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, the Native Americans that live here, And now he's going to trade with them. What's the first thing you need to be able to do to trade? Talk to them. Roger takes the time and learns their language. How many people here speak more than one language? It's not just word replacement, is it? There are entire concepts that need reevaluating when you're learning a new language. A simple explanation is a single sheet of paper for us is a sheet. You can have a sheet of glass. You can have a sheet of plywood, but it's a sheet of paper. In French, the term is feuille de papier, a leaf of paper. All the different things that go along with that one item are associated with that one word, a leaf of paper, the way that it falls, the nature of it. Roger learns the Native American language around here. It's an Algonquian language. And in the process, learns about the people, how they think, how they live, how they hunt, how they fish, how they live around here. In the process, he realizes that they utilize the entire landscape. They set fire to the woods every year. Gets rid of the ticks and fleas, gets rid of the poisonous plants, gets rid of all the underbrush and the softwood trees, leaving you hardwoods, oak, hickory, chestnut, walnut trees. The first things to come back are the grasses and the berry bushes, the blueberries, the strawberries, the raspberries. It leaves an open landscape. When some of the first European explorers came here, they said you could march an army through the thickest woods and no one would miss a step. It's a managed landscape, which means they're using all of it. They may not have built a fence around it, but it's all of theirs. So when he gets back to Plymouth, he says, if you want to live here, you have to make a deal with the people whose land this is. It's their land, the Native Americans. Make a deal with them for this land. That got him into trouble in Plymouth. So he leaves there and goes back up to Salem, where he's preaching these dangerous ideas that a minister should not be paid. He actually writes a letter to King Charles I back in England, telling the king that the king is committing a sin by giving away land over here that does not belong to him. How do you think that went over? Pressure is being put on the Massachusetts Bay to shut this guy up. In October of 1635, Boston sends soldiers up to Salem and they arrest Roger. They give him that opportunity. Just shut up. We don't care what your opinions are. Just don't preach them anymore. And he says, I can't. I can't shut off the truth. So they charge him. You know what his crime was? New and dangerous opinions. This is an extremely structured world. Something called the Great Chain of Being, with God and the angels at the top, kings and emperors, the nobility and the clergy, the upper classes, the middle classes, the lower classes, the flying animals, the walking animals, the crawling animals, all the way down to the sludge at the bottom of everything. Everything has its place. And Roger has new and dangerous opinions. Who are they dangerous to? People on top. He refuses to be quiet, so he's sentenced to exile. They're going to kick him out, but he is sick at the time. They let him stay in Salem for a couple of months. As long as he doesn't preach these dangerous opinions in church, he agrees. He has meetings at his home after Sunday services. Pretty soon his house is more crowded than the churches are, which was too much for the authorities in Boston. In the end of January 1636, they send soldiers from Boston up to Salem to arrest him, put him on the next boat back to England. Somebody warns him that they're coming, and Roger escapes into the wilderness. That's one of the favorite phrases. They enlarged him to the wilderness. This is January in New England. Roger is a city boy from London. We know how well they do in the winter around here. This is a winter like we don't normally have here. This Narragansett Bay was completely frozen over. A Dutch ship had tried to sail up the bay to trade at Dutch Island and was turned back because it was covered with ice, the entire bay. Hip-deep snow, and this city boy from London starts walking out of Salem to get away from the authorities. He nearly freezes to death when the Native Americans find him. They take him in, they give him a place to stay for the winter, and they take care of him, they feed him. And in the springtime, Roger Williams makes a deal with the Narragansett for the land that is now Providence. What is this deal? It wasn't money. Roger said there was no amount of money that could have paid for this. It was purchased by the love that they had for each other. The Narragansett are people that gain status by giving things away, and that great Salt Cove and that piece of land where Providence is was a tremendous resource. If you look at a modern map, from Route 6, from the tip of the Cape, goes right into the middle of Providence and off to the southwest. Route 44 comes from Plymouth right into Providence and goes directly west. Route 1 goes from the Massachusetts Bay right into Providence, then down along the coast here, all the way to Manhattan. These are all Indian highways that came to this place because of the resources it had. A large saltwater cove with 2 freshwater rivers feeding it, opening out into Narragansett Bay. There were 2 oyster beds in this cove with oysters up to a foot across. The English, when they got there, they would go out at low tide with baskets and pick up lobsters so they could feed them to the pigs. Seriously, have you seen a lobster? Who's the first person that picked that thing up and said, you know, if I boil this and then melt some butter, this is going to be delicious. The pigs loved them, that was enough. They got plenty of ham and bacon. There's a freshwater spring right next to this saltwater cove, but the real resource are these 2 rivers. Freshwater rivers come down, fill the cove, make it a nice brackish estuarine environment, and then it goes to a closing point where the Providence River begins. There's a ford across the river where Route 1, the original post road, goes across, where at low tide you could walk across. Now these 2 rivers are the home for North Atlantic salmon. Now, I'm sure you've seen all the pictures of the grizzly bears diving into the river head first and coming up with a nice 20, 25-pound salmon. No. These North Atlantic salmon don't go upstream once and die. They make the trip 4 or 5 times in their lifetime. And here in Providence, they were talking about 40, 50, 60 pounds apiece. And at that ford, the English said you could walk across the river on the backs of the salmon without even getting your feet wet. This was a resource spot that the Indians around here used very much the way the fur trappers' rendezvous out west are used. It's a place for everybody to come together, settle disputes, play games, get to know each other, make agreements, and then everybody went home. It's a tremendous resource. And the Narragansett saw all these roads coming together and the resource and gave it to Roger to put one more resource there, English goods. Roger traded English goods with the Native Americans. So now, when you come to get your salmon and your lobster and everything else, you can get your blankets, coats, axes, knives, all of those things. Plus, on a political level, it puts a cork in the bottle where all those roads come together, so the English aren't going to be coming down into Narragansett territory down here. It was brilliant politics. The English at Providence, one of the first things they wrote out was a special agreement on how the town was going to be run. Because remember, we don't have anything from England on how this is going to work. They decide that the heads of households are going to meet, and they're going to vote on things. And the majority vote will decide what they do, but only in civil things. Here, they're not going to make any religious rules. The basis of government in Providence starts off from its very beginning, separating church and state. That here there would be a civil government. Now, other people are getting in trouble in Massachusetts Bay. Anne Hutchinson, almost immediately after, gets tossed out, seeks Roger's help, and with Roger's help and negotiation with the Indians, they settle the town of Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Within a year or two, people will break away from Portsmouth and settle Newport. Another guy's coming in from Plymouth, comes to Providence, and ends up settling the town that we now call Warwick. These are all independent towns and settlements. They're not bound together by any single document. They are bound together by this commitment to freedom. But they have no legal documentation saying that this place does not belong to Connecticut or to Plymouth or to Massachusetts Bay. So Roger makes 2 more trips back to England to get the legitimate English documentation to stop the other English colonies. Connecticut tried to take the whole entire southern half of the state, right where we are. Could have been part of Connecticut. Why did they want this? In the age of sail, Narragansett Bay is in the perfect place to sail to the money colonies to the south. Even today, Newport to Bermuda, it's a 3 to 4 day trip. From Bermuda, you have the southern colonies, you have the Caribbean, you have the entire world opening up to you. If you're in Boston and try to sail out, you have to go outside the Cape, outside the islands, and then you're bucking the Gulf Stream. So a 3 to 4 day trip is going to take you 7 to 10 days just to get to Bermuda from Boston. That's why they all wanted this place, this Narragansett Bay. This was the doorway to the southern colonies. 2 trips back to England Roger Williams made. And finally, in 1663, King Charles II gives Rhode Island its official royal charter. In this charter, it says, in this colony, no person can be punished for what they believe. Going to try a lively experiment to see if you can have a good government separate from religion. It allows us to elect our own governors, to elect our own General Assembly, our own government. Here, it was not a royal governor appointed by the king who would come over here, stuff his pockets with our money, and then go back to England. Here, they're our neighbors. They're people we know. They're answerable to us. On that one of his first trips back to England, Roger wrote a book that nobody liked over there called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. And in that, he said, the foundation of civil power lies in the people. Then Roger wrote about this charter. He says this charter does 2 things. It gives us, here in Rhode Island, more liberty than any other place in the New World or the Old. Second, it gives us peace. Now, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Plymouth will no longer be seeking to invade and take our land. Not only that, but they won't be bothering the Native Americans here anymore. This little tiny colony forged ahead on its own with trade all over the world. And 100 years after Roger Williams dies, 13 colonies get into a big fight with England. What was that called? A lot of people call it the Revolution. Let's call it the War for Independence, because the Revolution actually comes just after it. This War for Independence, finally 13 colonies are now independent from England. They need a rule book. It's a brand new country. They need a rule book on how to run this country. So they put the Constitution together. Our charter from the king starts off beautifully written. Big picture of the king in the corner goes, Charles II, by the grace of God, king is going to allow the people of Rhode Island to do these things. He's going to let us have these borders. He gives us permission to do these things. Our Constitution doesn't have any little bit of that. It does not start off with Congress, by the grace of God, is going to let the American people do things. Harkening back to Roger Williams, the foundation of civil power lies in the people. The first 3 words of the Constitution, 10 times bigger than anything else in the document. Shout out to the rest of the world. A real revolution that we, the people, are going to tell the government what it can and cannot do. That very idea that the people are in control of the government was put into practice first, right where you guys are right now, here in Rhode Island. And that's why there's a national memorial to Roger Williams. Thank you, folks. Anybody have any questions? Excellent. Thank you.
Wow, that was awesome. I could not do anything like that. Dave, you wanted to say, you all set? Okay. All right. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Brian Oakley, an associate professor of environmental geoscience at Eastern Connecticut State University. He receives his PhD in environmental science with a concentration in geosciences from the University of Rhode Island. He is broadly trained in quaternary geoscientist with research interests in glacial, coastal, and marine depositional environments. The nature of his work offers him the chance to collaborate with other geologists, soil scientists like us, engineers, managers, biologists, which all brings a variety of experiences and perspectives to his teaching and student research projects, and to us too, to our projects for sure. And we've worked with you on many projects. His research has been in partnership with or funded by Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Department of Housing and Urban Development, NOAA, USGS, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Rhode Island Sea Grant, Save the Bay, and USDA NRCS. Welcome, Brian.
All right. Thank you, guys. Welcome to Rhode Island. I'm also a native Rhode Islander, although I work just over the border in the Nutmeg State. I'm still a Rhode Island resident and still am up here quite a bit working with collaborators at URI and other agencies. So I liked the top of the history slide a couple of presentations ago. We're going to try to do 500 million years in 30 minutes. That's not going to be easy, but luckily I'm a coastal marine glacial geologist, so we're going to go really fast through the bedrock geology. So the story of New England in terms of geology, and Rhode Island specifically, comes back to about three main orogenic events, or three main mountain building events. We had the Taconic, the Akkadian, and the Alleghanian orogenies. And these are different periods where smaller microcontinents at first were sutured on or collided with North America. So the Craton, the original part of North America, was a lot smaller, and basically everything from the Appalachians east has been added on over time. The most famous of these would be the Alleghanian, which happened 275-ish million years ago, with the final collision of Africa and North America, forming the Appalachian Mountains. That time it would have looked a little bit like the Himalayas, as you were the Rockies, as you came through, if you drove from the Midwest or from the South. And then Pangea began to break up. And once that rifting started is really when we got the Atlantic coast of the United States and developed kind of the eastern part from the Appalachians to the coast with the broad coastal plain province. And you see that today if you go south of New England, below the glacial limit. Right. As you look around the next few days, if you're fortunate enough, you take a few minutes, walk to the beach, take a drive somewhere, you'll notice, with the exception of the Narragansett Pier granite down here, which is not all that deformed, that was in place during that last collision with Africa, most of the rocks here are pretty folded and faulted and deformed. In fact, they've gone through these three different periods of deformation. So you've got them looking here with these big folded features here at Beaver State Park at the south end of Jamestown. You'll see similar deformation when you're looking around at Fort Getty Wednesday night while you're having clams and clam boil. All right. That results in this, I'm going to give you a very broad bedrock geology view of Rhode Island, in having a couple of different main structural provinces. Down here is, oh, sorry. Oh, I ruined my slide. Go back. That's supposed to be next. Got ahead of myself. If you go down here, this is the Narragansett Pier granite. It's basically a pinkish feldspar dominated granite. If you're a structural tectonic geologist, not all that interesting. The western half of Rhode Island is mostly a granitic-based metamorphic rock. A lot of it's granitic gneiss that actually just looks still like granite. You get some older volcanic rocks around Newport and the East Bay, but the main part of this central portion in yellow is what's called the Narragansett Basin. It's a structural pull-apart basin from the Pennsylvania and Permian ages, and it's mostly composed of metamorphosed sedimentary rocks from conglomerate, some world-famous stretch pebble conglomerates in Middletown, to sandstones and the metamorphic rocks, even some coal, although they used to joke that you could only burn the coal from Portsmouth up in here in hell. It was so metamorphosed. So it wasn't a major coal mining operation, but there was some, and you still found some beds of it here. And we're located along that western edge of the structural basin here in Narragansett, where we are today. And you'll drive over the boundary of it. If you go through Jamestown, it's called the Beaver Head Fault Zone, and you'll see it. It's a very prominent, low, marshy area. And if you're with a local, they'll point it out to you.
All right, but now we're going to jump forward. I'm going to cut through ludicrous speed and get to the more recent stuff and talk really just about the Quaternary, and I'll try not to go plaid. And if you got that joke, you're a fan of Mel Brooks. All right. So we're going to start really thinking about this with the Laurentide ice sheet. The Laurentide ice sheet was the most recent continental glaciation in North America, and you'll see it here reaching down in this depiction basically all of New England and into the center part of the United States. It's a separate ice sheet from the Cordilleran and mostly centered up around Hudson Bay. And if you really are a nerd about ice sheets, we could argue about one dome or multi-dome, but that doesn't really matter. We're down here near the southern margin of that ice sheet. And just an aside, why do we care about 26,000-year-old ice sheets? Of course, we study them and understand them in the past to understand what could be happening or is happening today to our modern ice sheets, notably Greenland, which isn't that far latitudinally from where we are today. So that's why we really focus on these ice sheets. Now, of course, in this room, you guys understand the other part of that, which is the deposits of that last glaciation really form the basis of the soils we find here in New England. Right. So geologically, this is a pretty quick event in New England. If you came here about 32,000 years ago, there was still a continental glacier, but it was up around the St. Lawrence Seaway Canadian border, and that's based on some limiting radiocarbon ages. And then it advanced fairly rapidly across New England, reaching its terminal position probably about 26,000 years ago. That coincides with the low stand in global sea level measured in Barbados and a whole bunch of other fun places. And then it began to retreat back, and it hung out at its maximum for a little while. Based on cosmogenic exposure ages, maybe a few thousand years. But then it started to retreat back to the north. And it's certainly out of Rhode Island well before what I've got shown there, 16,000. But this position here is based on the North American varve chronology. Varves are glacial lake floor sediment. It records an annual signal of the lake being open and then the lake being frozen. It's kind of like counting tree rings. And starting in the 1920s, there was a project by Ernst Antevs and then really brought into the modern by Jack Ridge at Tufts University to look at the timing of the ice sheet retreating up the Connecticut River Valley. So that gives us in New England a pretty good idea of where the ice sheet was from, say, 18,000-ish years ago to about 12,000 years ago. This early period where we are, it's a little harder to constrain, and that's where some of my work has been in the last 10 years or so. Again, people have been working on this for a while. This is a figure by Goldthwaite that was in Antev's publication, and they had recognized by then the major kind of geologic features related to the last glaciation, including these lines in red, which are the terminal and recessional moraines of the ice sheet. And there's some great books written on how they figured out this was glacial geology, starting first in Europe with Louis Agassiz. And if you want them, they're awesome books if you want to do some light reading over the summer. They're written for the educated layman. You guys would breeze through it. Right. In New England, that ice sheet advanced out basically from the north, but the tectonic geology and the bedrock geology did control some of that ice flow. So the western part of Connecticut and Rhode Island was one lobe of that ice sheet. And when you think about an ice sheet, if you've been to Alaska or you're familiar with the glaciers, Donald, I'm looking at you for Alaska, of course, but the Malaspina, these large piedmonts would have been about the size of one lobe of that ice sheet. And that would cover the eastern half of Connecticut into Rhode Island. And then that Narragansett structural basin, those slightly less resistant rocks, offered a path for the ice, and it flowed down here, kind of merging in an interlobe zone that occupies where actually I'm getting on a ferry and headed for field work right after I leave here, a place called Block Island right out here. But the terminal position is marked by end moraines across Long Island, just south of Block Island, and part of the offshore wind work for the wind turbines. We had done a lot of mapping out there and have a pretty good extent on the glacial geology there. Extended across a place called Cox's Ledge, over to Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and into the Gulf of Maine. So everything north of that line was covered by ice and then uncovered as the ice retreated to the north. Right. So if you came here 26,000 years ago, here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. As I tell my students, our campus is about here. If you wanted to go to the beach, you went to Block Island and walked another 80 miles or so. Because of that large continental glacier, as well as ones in Europe and Asia, global sea level was 120 meters or 400 feet lower. So this would have been about the shoreline at that time. There's a woolly mammoth running around. And so that's been mapped out. There's a global sea level curve on that. This is one we had published a version of, which had some relative sea level. We're not going to worry about that today because rebound is complicated. But global sea level started here at about 120 and then shot up pretty rapidly. And this rapid rise is the breakdown of the Laurentide ice sheet with a couple of periods called meltwater pulses, where sea level rose potentially meters or maybe even tens of meters in a couple of centuries. How thick was the ice? That's a pretty common thing we get. And there's a couple of schools of thought on this, and I'll generally persuade or dissuade you from saying it's a mile of ice in New England. In Hudson Bay, sure, but in New England, no. There was originally a lot of work done on thick ice, having it basically being what they call the top hat, so big, thick ice sheet with a narrow brim. But I think the science has been trending, and the work we've done and others have done in New England supports this, what we call more of a sombrero model, which has one or more domes of ice and then a long, kind of thinner margin. And so how thick? Well, maybe just over the top of the White Mountains, maybe not. And if Scott Davis is here, Tom Davis would have a lot of opinions on that, who's his brother, right? The ice probably just covered them, but not much more than that. So I'm a proponent of thinner ice in New England. Ballpark here at the last glacial maximum, 750 feet or so. All right, so we're more on the thin ice side of things. How do we guess that? Well, partly we use things like the White Mountains as dipsticks for where the ice might have been, but we also did some modeling work with isostatic rebound, and our line on red there would suggest in Kingston, I thought the talk was on the main campus of URI, in Narragansett, just a slight bit less, about 750 feet or so. All right. So the glacier that came and deposited a lot of this material, as I would say, it doesn't erode and deposit all of what you see. This is the last of several glaciations. We have evidence for at least a few in New England and adjacent areas. If you believe the ice modelers and some of the sea level work that's been done in the ocean cores, maybe as many as 9 over the last million years or so that had a similar extent to Laurentide. But this is what we're looking at today. It's the last configuration. And so as you're looking at this oblique view, here is Long Island, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, of course, the hook of Cape Cod, right, and Rhode Island right in here. And I'm going to focus here on this area here that you can't see anything of yet, but that's where we're going to head on the field tour on Wednesday. You guys will be down along the coastline there. Right. And you'll be seeing a couple of different landforms as you're driving around. And one of the most obvious will be as you're getting on a road called Route 1, which is the east-west road, just mentioned by John, that went along the coastline, right, just as you're heading south on Route 1, which really means you're heading west. It's Rhode Island, it's a little screwy. Right. On the right side is a big hill, and that's the Charlestown Moraine. And that's really the last really large recessional moraine as you go up through this till the center part of New England, which marked a still stand or at least a pause of the ice sheet, if not a re-advance during deglaciation. And based on some exposure ages, we'll call that about 21-ish thousand years or so old. So the ice was out here at 26, hung out for a while, and then started to retreat back. And how long it took to go from here to here is a really good debate, but it seems like it was probably over a few thousand years that it stepped backwards. Now, if you were here at that time, you would have noticed that, one, as we mentioned, global sea level was way out there. Narragansett Bay was not saltwater. And the landscape would have been dominated by glacial lakes. Right? And that's shown in the geology, not just in these reconstructions. This is a depiction of what glacial lakes Rhode Island and Block Island would have looked like. Glacial Lake Connecticut and Long Island Sound isn't uncovered yet by the ice. And then the ice started to retreat north, and this was some work I had done in my dissertation a bunch of years ago, and we're located just along Narragansett. There's the shoreline right there. If you look out into the bay, there's Dutch Island that John mentioned, kind of right out there. So this is a depiction, we call that about 20,200 years or so ago. The glacier would have been basically leaving the Bay campus, headed north, and was basically out of Rhode Island probably by 19,000. Right. Further up, there's a little map of still fresh water lakes in here. And how do we know it's fresh water? we find varves. Those glacial lake sediments that you can find forming in modern glacial environments we found today. Jim knows this firsthand. We took a whole bunch of sediment cores up in here for my dissertation work and looked at those varves. If you go to a place like Maine, which was under water with marine water during deglaciation, you don't find varves and you find marine fossils. So we have pretty good evidence, of course, this was not marine water, this was fresh water. Right. But here's another depiction kind of pointing to where we are in glacial lakes. They basically filled all of the major basins as well as a lot of the smaller basins not shown here. Right. So if we come back to that bedrock geology, what you'll see is the glacial geology is strongly influenced by it. This is a Quaternary deposits map. It's available on the Rhode Island Geographic Information Survey, which is a great GIS thing. And the nice thing of Rhode Island being so small is there's a lot of data, and we have access to it through a really great GIS system. And the three colors shown here is green is till, yellow are stratified deposits, so glacial meltwater deposits, and this darker green is the morainal deposits of Charlestown, Point Judith, and then Block Island, about 9 miles offshore. Right? And then this black line marks out the structural basin, and in here is the Narragansett Basin, right? And over here is that more granitic, kind of sandy environment. And why does that make a distinction? Well, the deposits look different. So if you're in that western side, you have a more of a granitic-based soil or sediment, and this is some granitic-based, what we call melt-out till at a place called Napatree Point. It's a small recessional moraine just north of Charlestown. My colleague, Drew Hyatt, there with a fairly large boulder sticking out of that bluff. Right. If you go into the structural basin of Narragansett, what you find are those carboniferous, those carbon-rich rocks are producing darker sediment, and this is some lodgement till based on that mineralogy, although here we're on the boundary between the two zones, so there's some granitic clasts as well, and some really cool ice wedge features going on too. So when we go out and map all this, one of the things that's been done a lot of in New England is mapping glacial geology. Just like was mentioned, a lot of the soil surveys started working Harvard and places like that, and in Connecticut and Rhode Island. A lot of the early work was done in New England as well for the same reasons. A lot of the universities were here and people were wandering around looking at the deposits. And one of the things people noticed starting in the 1940s, but really not figured out until the early 80s, is that the ice sheet here was marked by a series of landforms that stepped back in a very systematic way. In fact, Kotef named his paper Systematic Ice Sheet Retreat in New England. So the ice didn't just melt in place, it stepped back as the ice retreated to the north. And this produced a series of landforms, right, that we can map out on the landscape and provide the glacial geology units that a lot of people look at for doing things as at least first order, looking at the soil work. And that is taken to modern environments to look for analogs. So this is a subglacial meltwater tunnel exiting out in Alaska. So it's hard to see because Alaska is temperate, but this is actually ice. And that's covered with dirt and vegetation because the ice there in a fairly moist climate, you did have stuff growing on it. So that is ice under there. It's just covered by young till right now. And what's coming out here is this fountaining water is coming out of a subglacial tunnel. And so it's also recognized here that this is a pretty good analog for the geology of southern New England because the features look the same, the landforms are the same size and scale. Right? So if you come to New England 20,000 years ago, the one thing different is we didn't have any vegetation. Right? If coring a lot of the sediment, you learn pretty quickly there's no carbon in them. As my colleague Byron Stone from the USGS would say, if you were working here on the deglacial mapping as the ice sheet was leaving New England, you'd work in short sleeves about twice a year around the 4th of July, and the rest of the year was pretty cold and miserable. And there was very little life living near the ice sheet. But you would have had a source of meltwater coming out of the subglacial tunnel, and then this is a braided river forming a delta in front of that retreating ice sheet. And that landform is a pretty good analogy for what we'd see today. How do we know that? Again, you go out and do a lot of mapping. This is in a gravel pit actually up on Cape Cod. I was just at a conference last week. Again, Scott, if you're here, there's Tom. He said to say hi. These are braided river deposits on top of a delta on Cape Cod. Inside the delta, you'd find these dipping sandy beds. There's John Boothroyd. Many people who work in Rhode Island would know that name. It's also not a picture from Rhode Island, but it's the same idea. Okay. And in Rhode Island, we have a lot of built-up urban areas on our deltas. They're great spots to live. It's flat. You don't have to do any really shaping of the land to just go build something like, say, the State House of Rhode Island. So we got some work on the deltas using ground-penetrating radar. One of your host persons there is Jim Tureen. Surprisingly, nobody cared that we did this. All right, we asked for permission. The Capitol Police said, yeah, go ahead. We went across the street to the Department of Administration building, and it was like 5 layers of red tape, and I had to talk to 10 people. There's a joke in there about admin versus the governor. I don't know what it is, but it was pretty funny to just be walking around the State House with this thing. I mean, that could look like something nefarious, and Jim certainly looks nefarious, and we're dragging this thing around. And what this gave us was the ability to map these deltas with some geophysics. This is the Warwick Plains Delta, and how we did a lot of this reconstruction work, those models I made, was we figured out the elevation of these glacial lakes at different elevations going up and down the state, because this is all complicated by something called isostatic rebound. And that's something I'm not going to spend any time on, but basically the ice sheet pushed down on the lithosphere of the Earth, and then it lifted back up as the ice left, and that tilts everything different angles or different directions than it used to be. So all of this goes into making these geologic maps, right? The USGS has a whole series of them at the 1 to 24, some are at the 1 to 31,000 scale. And it's heavily based on understanding that this was a glacial lake dominated landscape. So what you see there, those dipping yellow foreset beds, those are marked deltas. Right? And so by seeing foresets in all of these different little gravel pits and outcrops, you start to understand that these were all little glacial ponds or lakes as the ice was retreating, right, up the valleys and out of New England, right? So you can use this to really get a pretty good look at what the landscape looks like. And as I tell my students, this is a pretty powerful tool, because if you have 3 drill holes and 1 little outcrop, you have a pretty good idea in the 3-dimensional structure of our landforms because of all this great mapping that's been done over the years. All right. Back to ludicrous speed. We're going to fast forward to the last 5,000 years or so. And as you look at this sea level curve, right, this is basically the time period I showed you reconstructions for. Right? Sea level then rose across the continental shelf very rapidly and really didn't get to about our present configuration until about 5,000 years ago, which is when sea level started to slow down towards the modern and then, of course, accelerate into the future. Right? And what that did was intersect the glacial geology with the coastal geology. And so when Debbie introduced me, she said, oh, I'm a broadly trained quaternary geologist. That just means I like to play in the sand, right? And it means I don't care if it's glacial sand or if it's coastal sand or marine sand. And a lot of the work here really bridges the two, because you can't do the coastal geology without understanding something about the glacial geology. And so when we go out to the field tour on Wednesday, you'll go to a barrier, right? So Nineveh, where you're going to go for one site, is a barrier. It's a barrier spit, not a barrier island. It's only connected at one end, not open at both ends. And that's a pile of modern marine sand deposited and formed on top of the glacial geology. So if we drill through Nineveh Barrier, we get to a glacial delta underneath. Okay? The other site we're going to go to on Mcniff is a glacial bluff. It's the same kind of material, and if the cut's as good as Jim's claiming it is, we'll see some of that sand and gravel from the braided river deposits, right? And there's a little tiny bit of coastal on top of that. Right? So this is really just coincidence where this elevation happened to be relative to modern sea level, whether we form barriers or whether we have an eroding bluff, which we'll look at Mcniff. Right? But this is an ongoing management question and management issue in New England, because the coastal, as somebody pointed out earlier, is a very dynamic environment. And this is a washover fan. This is a barrier right here. This is salt marsh. And this sand used to be here, and now it's here. And if you manage that salt marsh, you might scratch your head and go, okay, that's a problem. We got to dig all this up and restore our salt marsh. And the geologist in the room would stand up and say, hey, listen, with sea level rise, give that 10 years and that is your salt marsh. Right? And so leaving that there actually has become an important management decision. Although they are looking at areas of the marsh like this, right, and doing things like thin layer deposition. And so you may hear about that on the tour as well. Right, where we are looking at basically dredging sediment out of these channels for navigation and water quality and helping the salt marshes keep up with sea level rise, because we are losing them at a fairly rapid rate. Right? So where we're going to go on Wednesday is Mcniff. Mcniff is a glacial bluff. Right? Jim, is your sound off? Please turn it off. Only because, one of my colleagues on here is giggling like a schoolgirl, and she wouldn't be happy if I'm showing that clip. Right. She was a grad student. It was her first coastal storm. Right. Here we go. Unmute it. There we go. And what you're looking at there is the intersection of the coastal and the glacial, right? That is a essentially 21,000-year-old glacial sediment being eroded away, right, as waves are impacting that bluff during an extratropical storm, what we call a nor'easter around here. Right? So these glacial and coastal environments, right, are inherently linked in a place like New England. Right? Now that pavilion used to be there. We're going to go to that site, and if the beach was a little more eroded, we'd actually see the little nubs of the piling sticking up. I'm getting old, but I'm not that old. This was 2007-ish, and the beach now you'll see is the bluff is actually 10 meters or so beyond that spot. So we're going to go see a very dynamic spot when we go out to Mcniff. Right. The whole south shore in general is basically eroding. We've done some decadal scale shoreline change work where we look at old photographs, old aerial photography, we rectify it and get it into space and calculate erosion rates. And we're going to go to two sites. You guys are going to go to East Beach, which has seen about 40 or 50 meters of shoreline change since 1939. And then we're going to go to Mcniff, and we're going to see a place where it's gone back more than 70 meters in the last 60 years or so. And we'll talk about why that's been eroding so fast when we're in the field on Wednesday. But there isn't a lot of good news along this shoreline as far as erosion goes. These two little green spikes are, that's dredging and fill, and those are some little tiny groins put in the harbor refuge. So it's really not real deposition. It's kind of just minor little changes. All of that red basically means the shoreline is stepping back. And we're doing and looking at all this in the face of climate change and sea level rise. And so a lot of infrastructure and a lot of managers are now realizing their infrastructure is getting wet. And NOAA has a term called nuisance flooding, which means flooding of infrastructure that impacts people's lives. And if you were a business owner and this was your parking lot, or it was your access to your beach cabanas, if you're down in Watch Hill where this was taken, this starts to become a problem. We sat down here one night filming a time-lapse video of sea level rising through basically at a spring high tide. This is not a storm. I think it's bluebird sunny day. This just happened to be the higher high tides of the month. And this infrastructure, which was put in a few decades ago, is no longer elevated above that sea level rise. And as we sat here watching this, having some actually really good food, one of the guys on the team is a good chef, and just watched cars drive through this enlarging puddle and thinking about how many of them don't realize it's probably salt water. Right? And this is what we're watching happen. And sea level rise is not going to be this sudden wall of water at the end of the century. It's this steady incremental creeping. This happens now 6 days of the month, right? Maybe 8, 4 days each side of the spring and spring tides. In 5 years, it happens 10 times a month. In 10 years or 20 years, it's happening 15 days a month. And if you're the business owners there trying to access this spot, right, it gets to be a real nuisance, to use the flooding term, right? And all of this one problem is infrastructure that was put in that's just no longer at the right elevation. Right? Right. So where are we going to go with that? That's the very good question that I won't answer here, other than I'll point you to, this is an Army Corps of Engineers tool called the Sea Level Curve Calculator. This is put in for Newport, which is about 10 miles that way for the tide gauge. And starting in 2000, if you look at the Army Corps to the NOAA projections, we're likely to see somewhere between, say, 2, that's the low end, to 5. The NOAA extreme right now, based on rapid drawdown of ice sheets, is actually 11 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And really where we're going to know this is towards the end of my career. Right? When we get out into here, and I'm starting to get ready to retire, that's when we're going to really know if the curves have diverged or whether we're on the kind of on a fast trend or on a really fast trend, right? And unfortunately, most of the climate models have us somewhere up in here right now. And if you go to Newport when you're here at all, you go to downtown Jamestown, you go to any of these historic coastal cities, stand there at high tide. And I'm not that tall, so my eye level is about 5 feet off the ground. And if I stand at the high tide line and just turn in a circle and look at everything below 5 feet, in Newport, that's a pretty scary proposition. So it's got the attention of the coastal managers. Rhode Island's got one of the most proactive coastal management agencies in the country. It's become a national model for a lot of other states to look at. And that's basically because of our small size and having great leadership within that group. So while you're here, take a look around at it, think about any of the things you come up with, and we'll certainly talk more on the field tour on Wednesday. That's it. Have a question? Time for questions?
One question?
Yeah.
One of the slides you showed was the curve of the sea level of 120 meters lower than it is now. That curve there is very steep and starts to back off. So you got to project it out, say, just 500 years from now.
That's a good question. 500 years from now, if we continue, depends on which curve you like. If you just pick the middle of the road here, we'd be another 5 meters higher. So it's going to look pretty fast. It's going to look like can you go, I'll go back, Jim, I got it. What the modern would look like, right? If we get into an accelerated period of sea level rise, you're looking at a period like that in comparison. And so that's why the meltwater pulses are so scientifically interesting to people, is because these are periods, these almost vertical rises in here, right, are periods where Laurentide, or maybe West Antarctic, but probably Laurentide, lost a tremendous amount of ice in a very short period of time. And so as people are watching West Antarctic and Greenland, that's the geologic context they're thinking about. This happened 14,000 years ago when we lost a bleep ton of ice in a century. And what did that do to global sea level? And if we lose another bleep ton of ice from West Antarctic or Greenland, what happens to modern sea level? And that's the context we look at it. And it is a scary thought. So any of the coastal stuff, though, we can deal with Wednesday in Mcniff, and I'll leave you guys to get on with your conference. Thank you.
Yep. Dave?
So for better or worse, you get to hear from me again. So, before we break, and I think that's next, Debbie, right?
I just one announcement after yours.
Okay, so we do recognize Undersecretary Northey here, and Dave, if you want to bring up our map of Iowa. Yeah. So far we've talked a lot about a little policy, a little soils, science, but I also want to point out soil is also art. So one of the things that some of the folks have been doing is looking at soil color with depth and being able to produce maps that show how that color varies across. So Chad, wave, okay, Dylan, and I think Jason is the other one of your conspirators on this. So we're going to produce these for all of the states, which are the soil color maps for a given state. We want to present one to Undersecretary Northey for Iowa, near and dear to your heart. So the hope being that you will put that in your office to let folks know how soils vary with depth and across the landscape. So, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
So thank you to all our speakers this morning. That was an excellent round, good variety of talks. We're going to have a break, and then we're going to go into our breakout sessions. We have some of these around, so you'll know what committee to go to. Corliss is going to have soil and ecosystem dynamics and taxonomy, that's here. Hazard A and B, where when you walked into registration, the room on the left is hazard A and B. That's going to be standards, hydric, soils, and subaqueous, and that's where we're going to have this afternoon the state soil scientist meeting. The small auditorium is Right next to the hazard A and B, we'll open up the door for that. Interpretations, technology is going to be there, and then in the afternoon, the workshop, algorithms for quantitative pedology is going to be there. And the large conference room is, if you're going to registration to the right, looking out over the water is the large conference room. That's going to be bylaws and research. So look for these and ask one of us if you don't know where to go. So thank you to all our speakers this morning, and thank you, Undersecretary Northey, for attending. Thank you.